I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and until a Tuesday afternoon in October, I was secretly funding my family's lavish lifestyle. I was literally hovering my mouse over a $15,000 wire transfer to pay my parents' mortgage and my sister's luxury car lease. Then my phone vibrated with a video message from my Aunt Carol. She is terrible with technology and accidentally sent it to me instead of my cousin. When I hit play, I watched my own family raise expensive champagne glasses and mock my worn-out clothes, calling me a pathetic failure who dragged down their reputation. I did not cry. I just calmly moved my mouse and clicked cancel instead. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. I looked down through the soundproof glass of my corner office. Below me, 500,000 square feet of polished concrete hummed with relentless activity. Automated conveyor belts whirred, transporting thousands of packages, while a fleet of forklifts danced between towering racks of inventory. This was my empire. A logistics and e-commerce fulfillment center that generated millions in revenue each quarter. I built it from the ground up, starting with a single leased storage unit and a maxed-out credit card. Now I employed over 200 people. But to my parents, my sister Brittany and her husband Jamal, I was just a sad, struggling inventory clerk who moved boxes for an hourly wage. I preferred it that way. Keeping my wealth a secret was the only way I could maintain any semblance of peace. My family was obsessed with status designer labels and portraying a life of excessive luxury. They judged human worth strictly by the price tag on a handbag or the hood ornament on a car. Because I showed up to family dinners in a simple Target sweater and drove a reliable 12-year-old Toyota, they viewed me with absolute contempt. They saw me as the dark mark on their carefully curated social image. What they did not know was that their flawless image was entirely funded by the pathetic daughter they so deeply despised. 4 years ago, my parents Richard and Patricia were on the brink of absolute financial ruin. They had remortgaged their home to fund a series of foolish investments simply to keep up appearances in their affluent Chicago suburb. When the bank threatened foreclosure, I intervened. Not directly, of course. I knew their pride would never allow them to accept a handout from the daughter they deemed a failure. Instead, I used my attorneys to set up a blind corporate entity. Through this anonymous limited liability company, I purchased their distressed debt. I became their secret benefactor, paying their massive mortgage, covering their property taxes, and effectively keeping a roof over their heads. I did the exact same thing for my younger sister Brittany and her husband Jamal. Jamal is an African-American real estate agent who loved to boast about his multi-million-dollar listings on social media, but the reality was that he barely closed enough deals to cover the cost of his custom-tailored suits. When their luxury car leases and the rent on their oversized mansion went into default, my company quietly absorbed the debt. Every single month on the fourth day of the month, I sat at my desk and authorized a $15,000 wire transfer to keep their house of cards from collapsing. Today was the 4th of the month. The banking portal was open on my monitor. The cursor hovered over the bright green authorize button. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, ready to finalize the payment that would secure their luxurious lifestyle for another 30 days. Then my phone vibrated on the desk. It was a message from my Aunt Carol. She is a sweet woman, but notoriously terrible with smartphones. She frequently sent grocery lists to the family group chat and accidentally posted private photos to her public timeline. I tapped the screen, expecting another blurry picture of her garden. Instead, it was a video file. The text beneath it read, "Look how much fun we had at Brittany's house yesterday." It was clearly meant for my cousin, but her clumsy fingers had selected my name instead. I pressed play. The screen filled with the high-definition image of my sister's sunlit patio. They were having a lavish afternoon gathering. The patio table was laden with imported cheeses, artisan crackers, and an ice bucket holding 3 bottles of vintage champagne. Those bottles alone cost more than what they believed my weekly salary was. My mother, Patricia, was leaning back in a plush lounge chair, her hair perfectly blown out, holding a crystal flute. My father, Richard, was laughing heartily at something Jamal had just said. Jamal stood near the expensive outdoor grill wearing a pristine white polo shirt and a flashy gold watch, looking every bit the successful mogul he pretended to be. "I am just saying," Jamal said to the camera, his voice dripping with condescension, "we really need to stop inviting Cassidy to these daytime events. Did you see her pull up in that rusted-out Toyota last week? It makes the whole driveway look like a junkyard. It is embarrassing." My sister Brittany stepped into the frame, tossing her long blonde extensions over her shoulder. "Tell me about it," she laughed, taking a sip of champagne. "I literally had to tell my neighbors she was the hired cleaning help. I cannot have people thinking I am related to someone who shops at discount stores." The camera panned slightly as Aunt Carol, holding the phone, chuckled along with them. Then my mother spoke up, her voice cutting through the sunny afternoon air with casual cruelty. "She is a pathetic failure," Patricia said, waving her hand dismissively. "I honestly do not know where she came from. She has absolutely zero ambition. We should honestly start charging her an admission fee just to sit at our table. Maybe $2,000 a month just to be associated with our family. It is the least she could do to compensate for the humiliation she causes us." The video ended with a chorus of laughter. The screen went black, reflecting my own face in the dark glass of my phone. I sat in the absolute quiet of my soundproof office. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the wall. The dull, constant ache of trying to win my family's love, an ache I had carried in my chest for over 3 decades, suddenly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, brilliant clarity. I looked back at my computer monitor. The green authorize button was still waiting for my click. $15,000 of my hard-earned money ready to be sent to people who sat on furniture I paid for, drinking champagne I essentially financed, while calling me a pathetic failure to my face. They thought they were untouchable. They believed their wealth was secure, protected by some faceless financial institution that magically forgave their constant defaults. They had no idea that the foundation of their entire existence rested on a single click of my mouse. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady. I did not click authorize. I dragged the cursor a few inches to the left. I clicked cancel. Then I picked up my phone and dialed my wealth management attorney to ensure the automatic grace periods on all their accounts were officially terminated. The countdown to their ruin had officially begun. "David," I said into the receiver the moment my wealth management attorney answered the phone, "I need you to execute an immediate cessation of all automated disbursements from the Vanguard LLC account. Terminate the grace periods across the board." David paused on the other end of the line. He knew exactly what those accounts funded. "Cassidy, if we stop the disbursements today, the mortgage on the Chicago property and the auto leases will go into immediate default. They will be subject to rapid collections and asset repossession within days. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" "That is exactly what I want," I replied, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "Send the default notices to their physical addresses through the standard channels. I do not want them to know the LLC is connected to me. Let the banks and the repossession agencies handle the dirty work." David confirmed the orders and the call ended. I sat back in my chair and looked out over my warehouse. For 4 years, I had justified my secret financial support as a twisted form of familial duty. I had convinced myself that keeping them afloat was the right thing to do, even if they treated me like dirt. I thought that by secretly protecting them from their own reckless financial decisions, I was being the bigger person. But that video had shattered the illusion. I was not their daughter or their sister. I was an ATM they did not even know they were using. 3 days later, Thanksgiving arrived. My mother, Patricia, had texted me that morning with her usual list of demands. "Cassidy, make sure you bring that expensive Napa Cabernet, not the cheap grocery store swill you usually buy. And Jamal mentioned you should probably pitch in for the catering this year. Bring cash." I did not argue. I bought the exact wine she demanded. I even went to the bank and withdrew 5 crisp $100 bills. It would be the last cash they ever saw from me. I drove my 12-year-old Toyota up the sweeping manicured driveway of my parents' colonial estate in the upscale Chicago suburbs. The irony was palpable. The towering oak trees, the perfectly pristine brickwork, the grand double doors. I owned every single inch of it. The deed, sitting in David's office, had my LLC's name on it. But as I parked my faded sedan next to Jamal's gleaming black Mercedes SUVs, I knew the reception waiting for me inside would be as icy as the November wind. I walked up the stone steps and rang the doorbell. Brittany threw the door open. She was wearing a designer silk dress that I had indirectly paid for and was holding a glass of wine. "Oh, you are here," Brittany said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She looked me up and down, taking in my plain dark jeans and simple wool sweater. "I guess you did not get the memo about dressing up for the holidays. Did you just get off a shift at the warehouse?" "Something like that," I said, stepping inside. The house smelled of roasted turkey and expensive spices. In the grand foyer, Jamal was holding court with my father, Richard. Jamal was wearing a custom-tailored velvet blazer, a thick gold chain resting against his dark skin. When he saw me, he did not even bother to hide his smirk. "Cassidy," Jamal called out, his voice booming through the foyer. "I saw that piece of junk you parked in the driveway. Man, you are bringing down the property value of the whole neighborhood. You really need to upgrade. I just closed a massive deal on a downtown penthouse last week. If you ever want to stop moving boxes and learn how real money is made, let me know." It was a blatant lie. I knew for a fact Jamal had not closed a real estate deal in 6 months. His broker license was barely active. He was surviving purely on the credit cards that my LLC was paying off. "I will keep that in mind, Jamal," I said smoothly, handing my coat to the maid my parents had hired for the evening. My father, Richard, swirled his bourbon glass and shook his head at me. "Your brother-in-law is trying to help you, Cassidy. You should listen to him. Jamal understands how the world works. He understands leverage, ambition, scaling. Things you clearly lack sitting in that dusty warehouse of yours." "Richard is right, my mother," Patricia chimed in, emerging from the kitchen with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. She snatched the wine bottle from my hands without a single word of thanks. "We were just talking about how embarrassing it is to explain your situation to our friends at the country club. Everyone else's children are thriving. Brittany is a prominent social media influencer. Jamal is a real estate tycoon. And you are just a warehouse worker." She sighed heavily, playing the part of the long-suffering mother. "It is exhausting constantly covering for you, Cassidy." I stood in the center of the foyer, surrounded by their arrogance. I looked at Jamal's flashy jewelry, at Brittany's designer dress, at my parents' smug, satisfied faces. They were standing in a house I was about to let the bank seize. They were driving cars that were days away from being towed. They were an illusion, a house of cards completely ignorant of the hurricane that was about to strike. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the envelope containing the $500 in cash, and placed it on the entryway console. "My contribution for the catering," I said quietly. Patricia snatched the envelope immediately, her fingers quickly counting the bills. "Well, it is the bare minimum, but I suppose it will do. Try not to make a scene at dinner, Cassidy. We have a lot to celebrate today." We moved into the formal dining room, a space dominated by a massive mahogany table laden with an extravagant feast. As we took our seats, Richard raised his crystal goblet, demanding everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast to Jamal," Richard announced, his voice swelling with pride. He'd just secured another multi-million-dollar property, securing his place as one of the top agents in the city. "He is exactly the kind of ambitious, successful man this family needs. A true provider." Jamal grinned, wrapping an arm around Brittany, who beamed as if she had personally earned the imaginary commission. They clinked their glasses, basking in the fraudulent praise. I quietly sipped my water, watching the performance unfold. As the toast concluded, Patricia set her glass down and turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. The celebratory mood in the room shifted instantly into something predatory. "Speaking of financial moves," Patricia began, her tone carrying a dangerous edge, "Brittany has a brilliant business opportunity to launch her own luxury lifestyle brand. It is going to be incredibly lucrative. But she needs a little more seed capital to get the initial inventory." She leaned forward, locking eyes with me. Since you have no husband, no children, and no real expenses living in whatever tiny apartment you rent, your father and I have decided it is time for you to contribute to this family properly. We want you to liquidate your retirement savings and invest it into your sister's brand. What are your thoughts on this situation? I looked around the mahogany table, letting the sheer audacity of my mother's demand settle in the air. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the roasted turkey, and silver platters highlighting the absolute absurdity of this moment. They were sitting in a multi-million-dollar house I secretly owned, eating a catered dinner I had just been forced to subsidize with cash, and now they wanted to drain the very last drop of my perceived financial security. Brittany leaned forward, flashing a perfectly manicured smile that looked more like a predator baring its teeth. It is just a temporary loan, Cassidy. My brand is going to explode next quarter. You know I have over 100,000 followers now. Brands are begging to work with me. You will get your money back with interest. Plus, it is not like you need it for anything important right now. You are not exactly saving for a wedding or college funds for kids. Jamal chimed in, pointing his fork at me. Exactly. You have got to let your money work for you, Cass. Sitting on a measly 401k is a rookie mistake. You invest in family. We scale Brittany's brand, and you get to ride our coattails to a better tax bracket. It is a win for everyone. My father, Richard, nodded in solemn agreement, slicing into his turkey. Family supports family, Cassidy. Jamal and Brittany are building a legacy. Your mother and I have given you everything, and it is time you showed some gratitude. Liquidate the account on Monday. We will have Jamal's accountant handle the transfer so you do not mess up the paperwork. They had it all planned out. They had already spent my money in their minds. I set my fork down quietly. The clink of the silver against the fine china echoed in the sudden silence of the room. I looked directly at my mother, then at my father, and finally at my sister. No, I said. The word hung there sharp and heavy. Patricia frowned clearly, thinking she had misheard me. Excuse me, I said no, I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly level. I will not be liquidating my retirement savings to fund a vanity project. My finances are my own business, and they are not open for family distribution. The masks slipped instantly. The fake patronizing smiles vanished, replaced by a vicious, ugly entitlement that I had witnessed my entire life. Patricia slammed her hand flat against the table. How dare you speak to us like that? We ask you for one simple favor, one opportunity to actually contribute to this family, and you sit there acting like some arrogant miser. You are incredibly selfish, Cassidy. Richard's face flushed with anger. He pointed a stern finger at me. Do not be stupid. You work in a warehouse. You have zero financial literacy. We are offering you a chance to be part of something successful. You owe your sister this support. You owe us. I owe you absolutely nothing, I replied, my voice remaining unnervingly calm. I pay my own bills. I live entirely within my means. I have never once asked any of you for a single dime. Yet you feel entitled to the money I have worked for simply because Brittany refuses to get a real job and Jamal's real estate career is entirely fictitious. Jamal shot up from his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. Watch your mouth. You have no idea what you are talking about. I closed deals you could not even comprehend. Brittany burst into dramatic theatrical tears, burying her face in her hands. Why is she always like this? Brittany sobbed loudly. She always has to ruin everything. She is so bitter and jealous of my life that she would rather watch me fail than help me succeed. I cannot stand her negative energy. My mother rushed to comfort her golden child, glaring at me with pure hatred. Look at what you have done. You are a bitter, lonely spinster, Cassidy. You are a pathetic failure who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. You bring nothing but embarrassment to this family. If you will not support your sister, then you have no place at this table. I looked at the four of them. For 33 years, these people had made me feel small. They had criticized my clothes, mocked my career, and treated my existence as a burden. For the last 4 years, I had secretly kept the roof over their heads, paid for the cars they drove, and funded the champagne they drank while they insulted me. I had done it out of some misplaced sense of familial duty, hoping that somewhere beneath their superficial greed they actually loved me. But the video Aunt Carol sent was the truth. This was the truth. They did not love me. They loved what they could extract from me. I picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth deliberately, and placed it on the table. Then I stood up. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said. "I do not belong at this table." I walked out of the dining room and into the grand foyer. I retrieved my simple wool coat from the closet. My father followed me out, his face purple with rage. "If you walk out that door, you are done," Richard shouted. "Do not expect us to bail you out when you end up broke and alone. We are cutting you off. You will get nothing from us ever again." I slipped my arms into my coat and turned to face him. I looked past him, taking in the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandelier, the marble floors. "My house. I hope you all maintain this exact level of luxury next week," I said, offering him a cold, bright smile. "Enjoy the rest of your holiday." I opened the heavy mahogany door and stepped out into the freezing November night. I did not look back. I walked down the driveway, got into my 12-year-old Toyota, and started the engine. As I drove away from the estate, I pulled over on a quiet suburban street. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and systematically blocked my mother, my father Brittany, and Jamal. I blocked them on my phone, my email, and all social media platforms. I severed the digital cord with clinical precision. When I merged onto the highway heading back to the city, I turned the radio off and drove in complete silence. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried my entire life was gone. I felt lighter than air. I knew exactly what was coming. The 5th of the month was only a few days away. The grace periods were gone. The automated payments were canceled. The financial guillotine was going to drop, and I was going to sleep perfectly well when it did. 5 days later, the fallout began precisely on schedule. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Brittany was downtown at an ultra-luxury spa, favored by Chicago's social elite. She had booked a full day of treatments, a gold leaf facial, a deep tissue massage, and a premium styling session, all for herself and two of her influencer friends. She had intended to put the $1,500 bill on her platinum credit card, the one backed by the joint account my LLC secretly funded. According to the frantic, humiliating details that would later spill out through extended family gossip, Brittany approached the pristine marble reception desk, with her friends standing right behind her. She handed her heavy metal card to the receptionist with a practiced, arrogant flip of her wrist. The receptionist swiped the card. The terminal beeped an angry, jarring tone. "I am sorry, ma'am," the receptionist said politely. The card was declined. Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes for her audience. "Run it again. Your machine is obviously broken. Do you know how much money is in that account?" The receptionist ran it a second time. Another harsh beep. "It is declining, ma'am. The terminal says the account has been frozen due to severe delinquency. Do you have another form of payment?" Brittany's face burned crimson. Her friends exchanged awkward, judgmental glances. Brittany furiously dug into her designer purse and pulled out another card, a joint card tied to Jamal's business account. She slapped it onto the counter. The receptionist swiped it. "Declined." "Ma'am," the receptionist's voice grew significantly colder. "I need a valid form of payment for the services rendered today." Panic clawed at Brittany's throat. She snatched her phone and aggressively dialed my number, intending to scream at me. In her mind, she probably assumed I had somehow forgotten to process the $2,000 family tax they felt entitled to. She expected to berate me until I transferred funds to save her. Instead of a ringing tone, she received an automated carrier message. "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." She tried texting, not delivered. She tried WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook, blocked across every single platform. I had built a fortress of silence, and she was standing outside of it holding a worthless piece of plastic. She was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation of calling Jamal, begging him to figure out what was wrong with the bank. But Jamal could not help her. When Jamal logged into their banking portals, he saw a sea of red text. Past due, delinquent, frozen. The mysterious angel investor entity that had effortlessly covered their massive overhead had vanished without a trace, leaving them completely exposed to the crushing reality of their own debt. They were standing on a trap door and the floor had just dropped out. Jamal stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, the red negative numbers reflecting in his widened eyes. The front door of their rented mansion slammed open. Brittany stormed into the foyer, her face streaked with ruined designer makeup, screaming about the absolute humiliation she had just endured at the luxury spa. Jamal did not even look up to comfort her. He just pointed a trembling finger at the banking monitor. The anonymous safety net that had funded their extravagant lifestyle for years was entirely gone. 3 nights later, the illusion of their wealth was physically ripped from their driveway. It was shortly past midnight. The deep guttural rumble of heavy diesel engines vibrated through the expensive hardwood floorboards of their mansion. Flashing amber lights painted the bedroom walls in harsh rhythmic strokes. Jamal bolted upright in his silk pajamas and rushed to the window. 2 massive tow trucks were backed into the driveway. Operators in high-visibility vests were already securing heavy steel chains to the axles of their matching black Mercedes SUVs. Jamal sprinted out the front door into the freezing night air, waving his arms frantically. "Stop what you are doing! This is a massive bank error! I am a top-tier real estate broker. Unhook those cars right now before I sue your entire company." The lead repo man did not even blink. He pulled a crumpled clipboard from his heavy winter jacket and handed a thick stack of default notices to Jamal. "There is no error, buddy. Your lender ordered an immediate repossession due to severe delinquency. These vehicles belong to the bank now. Step back, or I will call the police to assist with the recovery." Brittany stood in the doorway, clutching her designer robe, sobbing hysterically. Across the street, the exterior lights of the neighboring houses flicked on one by one. The wealthy neighbors they had spent years trying to impress were now standing at their windows watching the glorious, undeniable downfall of the fake real estate mogul and his influencer wife. The tow trucks rumbled down the street, taking their dignity and their transportation with them. Back inside the cavernous, empty house, the blame game began. Jamal frantically dialed the customer service number for the anonymous financial firm that had always bailed them out. He navigated the phone tree with rising panic, only to be met with a cold, automated voice stating that his account was in severe default and had been transferred to a third-party collections agency. The line disconnected. Jamal threw his phone against the wall, shattering the screen into pieces. He turned his rage onto Brittany. "This is your fault," he screamed. "You maxed out the cards on your stupid spa days and fake designer bags. You drained the accounts." Brittany screamed right back, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Do not project your failures onto me. You have not sold a single property in a year. You play golf every day and call it networking. You are a complete fraud, Jamal." The toxic foundation of their marriage cracked and splintered. Without my money to cushion them, they were nothing but 2 arrogant strangers trapped in a house they could no longer afford. While Jamal and Brittany were tearing each other apart, the financial Grim Reaper was making its way to the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. It was the 20th of the month. My mother Patricia was enjoying her morning coffee in the sunroom, waiting for a delivery of imported Italian linens. A black SUV parked silently at the curb. A man in a cheap gray suit walked briskly up the sweeping driveway and rang the doorbell. Patricia opened the heavy mahogany door, fully expecting a delivery driver to grovel at her feet. Instead, the man handed her a thick, legally binding manila envelope. "You have been served," he stated flatly, turning on his heel and walking away. Patricia frowned, tearing open the envelope. She pulled out the stack of documents. Bold black letters screamed across the top page. "Notice of foreclosure. Immediate eviction pending." The anonymous LLC had ceased all mortgage payments. The bank had initiated proceedings to seize the estate. Patricia dropped her coffee mug. The ceramic shattered against the marble floor, splashing hot liquid across her expensive slippers. She collapsed against the doorway, gasping for air, as her perfect world crumbled around her. When Richard came home and saw the papers, absolute panic set in. He locked himself in his home office and began frantically dialing his golf buddies, the country club elites, and the local business owners he had spent years bragging to. He tried to frame it as a temporary liquidity issue, asking for a short-term bridge loan to cover the mortgage. One by one, they politely but firmly declined. Word travels at lightning speed in wealthy circles. They already knew about Jamal's repossessed cars. They smelled blood in the water. Richard, the proud, arrogant patriarch, was reduced to begging, and he was met with nothing but closed doors and dial tones. The following afternoon, the entire family converged at my parents' house. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. Jamal and Brittany had been forced to take a public bus to the suburbs because they no longer had vehicles. Brittany was hyperventilating on the living room sofa, her carefully curated influencer facade completely destroyed. Jamal was pacing the floor, chewing his fingernails nervously. Richard was red in the face, pouring himself a massive glass of scotch. In a normal family, this would be the moment for self-reflection. This would be the moment to look at their massive credit card bills, their unnecessary luxury purchases, and realize their own greed had destroyed them. But my family was not normal. They were narcissists. They needed a scapegoat. They needed me. "It is Cassidy's fault," Richard declared, suddenly slamming his glass down on the home bar. "If she had just given us her retirement fund at Thanksgiving, like we asked, we could have used that cash to float the mortgage and negotiate with the bank. We could have saved Jamal's cars. She knew we needed capital for Brittany's business, and she selfishly kept it for herself." Patricia seized onto the narrative with desperate enthusiasm. "Yes, exactly. She is an incredibly selfish, bitter girl. She did this to us intentionally. She saw us struggling and walked out the door. After everything we have done to tolerate her presence in this family, she stabs us in the back." Jamal stopped pacing. His eyes lit up with a dangerous, desperate idea. "Where does she work?" he asked. "That massive warehouse down by the industrial park, right? We go there. Tomorrow morning, we find her manager. We embarrass her in front of her coworkers until she takes out a personal loan to fix this. She owes us. We are not going down while she sits on thousands of dollars in retirement savings." They nodded in unison, completely convinced of their own twisted logic. They believed they could simply march into my workplace, bully me into submission, and force me to hand over my life savings to patch the holes in their sinking ship. They were incredibly eager to hunt down the pathetic warehouse clerk. They had absolutely no idea they were about to walk straight into the lion's den. The next morning, a rented, dented Kia Optima sputtered into the visitor parking lot of my 500,000-square-foot logistics campus. I watched the live security feed from my corner office monitor, sipping a fresh espresso. Jamal and Brittany stepped out of the tiny car, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of my towering glass facade and the endless line of 18-wheelers backing into the loading docks. Brittany was wearing oversized sunglasses, desperately trying to hide her swollen, tear-streaked face, while Jamal marched toward the sliding glass doors with the furious, unearned entitlement of a man who still believed he owned the world. Down in the pristine, marble-floored lobby, they stormed up to the front desk. I turned up the audio feed on my monitor. "I need you to go to the back and fetch Cassidy," Jamal demanded, slamming his hand on the reception desk. "She is an inventory clerk here. Tell her it is a family emergency, and her sister needs her right now." Donovan, my head of security, stepped forward. He is a former Marine who does not tolerate disrespect, especially not in my building. "Sir, I am going to need you to step back from the desk. We do not have inventory clerks that take unannounced personal visits in the middle of a shift. If you do not have an appointment, you need to leave the premises." Brittany pulled off her sunglasses, her voice shrill and trembling. "You do not understand. We are her family. She is just a box pusher. Tell her supervisor that Brittany is here and she needs to come out immediately." Donovan crossed his arms, looking completely unamused. "Lady, I do not care who you think you are. The person you are asking for does not take walk-in appointments. Now return to your vehicle before I have you trespassed." Jamal puffed out his chest, trying to summon the intimidation tactics that used to work when he drove a Mercedes. "Do you know who I am? I am a top-tier real estate broker. You go get her right now, or I will have your job." Donovan actually laughed, a deep, resonant chuckle that echoed in the cavernous lobby. "In that rental car? Sure you are, buddy. Door is behind you." Humiliated and completely powerless, Jamal and Brittany were escorted out the glass doors by 2 security guards. I watched them march back to the rented Kia. Jamal was pacing the asphalt like a caged animal. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The external security cameras captured the audio perfectly. "Richard, your useless daughter refuses to even come to the lobby," Jamal screamed into his phone, his voice cracking with panic. "You need to fix this right now. You need to drive down here and force her to empty her accounts." Through the phone's speaker, I could hear my father's panicked voice. "Jamal, the bank just called me again. They are talking about a secondary lien on the house." "What secondary lien?" "We never authorized a home equity line of credit." Jamal froze. The color completely drained from his face. Brittany stopped crying and stared at her husband. "Richard, listen to me," Jamal stammered, pacing frantically. "I had to do it. The market was slow. I needed capital to float the business. I just used your name on the application to secure the loan. It was supposed to be temporary. But now that the primary mortgage is in foreclosure, the secondary lender is threatening to audit the signatures." "You forged my signature!" Richard's voice echoed through the speaker, trembling with absolute horror. "You committed federal fraud and attached it to my house. I was trying to provide for your daughter, Jamal," yelled back, completely abandoning any shred of accountability. "If the bank looks too closely at those documents, I am going to federal prison, Richard. You have to cover this. We need Cassidy's money right now to pay off the secondary lender before they report the forgery." Suddenly, my mother's voice pierced through the speakerphone. Patricia had clearly snatched the phone from Richard. Any normal parent would have been outraged that their son-in-law had committed a felony and destroyed their financial standing. But Patricia was incapable of normal logic. Her toxic favoritism immediately shielded Jamal and sought out the designated scapegoat. "This is all Cassidy's fault," Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing across the parking lot. "If she had just given us her retirement fund at Thanksgiving, when we asked, Jamal would not have been forced to take such desperate measures. She pushed him into this. She pushed our family into this crisis because she is a selfish, vindictive little brat." I sat in my plush leather chair watching the screens as Brittany nodded along with my mother's deranged logic. They were literally excusing federal wire fraud and forgery by blaming the victim they had been mocking just days prior. Within 10 minutes, my phone began lighting up with voicemails. I had blocked their numbers, but the carrier still caught the automated voicemail drops. I played them on speakerphone in my office, marveling at the absolute insanity of their demands. "Cassidy, you listen to me," Patricia hissed in the first recording. "Jamal's entire life is on the line because of your financial selfishness. You are going to go to the bank today, take out a personal loan against whatever assets you have, and wire the money to Jamal's lawyer. If you refuse to save this family, I swear to God I will drag you to court. I will sue you for elder abandonment. I will make sure everyone knows you let your own parents lose their home and your brother-in-law go to prison out of pure spite." The second voicemail was from Richard. "We are out of options, Cassidy. You owe us for raising you. You are going to fix this, or you are dead to us." I deleted the voicemails with a calm, steady press of a button. Dead to them. That was the most beautiful promise they could have ever made. They were spiraling, desperately grasping at straws, entirely unaware that the net was about to close completely. The eviction notices were finalizing. The repo agencies were closing the files. It was time for the final act. I picked up my desk phone and called David, my wealth management attorney. "David, it is time," I said. "Send the final settlement summons to all of them. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal. Require their mandatory attendance at the downtown executive boardroom on Friday morning. Inform them that the principal director of the fund managing their debt is willing to meet for one final negotiation before the evictions and criminal fraud reports are made permanent." "Understood, Cassidy," David replied smoothly. "They will receive the couriered summons by this afternoon. Shall I prepare the final asset forfeiture documents for the meeting?" "Have them printed and bound," I instructed. "I want them completely legally cornered." Down in the parking lot, Jamal kicked the tire of his rented Kia, screaming in frustration as Brittany sobbed into her hands. They drove away in absolute disgrace, believing they were heading home to figure out a way to manipulate a faceless corporate CEO. They were going to dress in their best remaining clothes, practice their saddest victim stories, and walk right into the boardroom expecting to manipulate a stranger. They had no idea they were about to come face to face with the pathetic failure they had created. The morning of the settlement meeting arrived with a bitter, freezing wind sweeping off Lake Michigan. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal sat around a massive oak table in the penthouse boardroom of Vanguard Financial Holdings. They had dressed in their finest remaining garments, desperately trying to project an aura of wealthy indignation. Richard wore his bespoke navy suit. Patricia draped herself in pearls that were already secretly pawned in her mind. Brittany clutched an empty Birkin bag like a shield, while Jamal sweated through the collar of his velvet blazer. Richard tapped his gold pen against the polished oak, his impatience poorly masking his sheer terror. "Who does this anonymous CEO think he is?" Richard complained, adjusting his silk tie. "Making us wait 15 minutes is a deliberate insult. When he gets here, I will do the talking. We explain that this is a temporary market fluctuation. Men of wealth understand real estate cycles. We just need a 90-day bridge extension." Patricia nodded, practicing her most aristocratic, long-suffering smile. "Exactly. We tell him we are victims of a shifting economy, and if he tries to push back, we remind him who we are in this city." The heavy double doors at the end of the boardroom clicked open. The sound of sharp, rhythmic footsteps echoed against the glass walls. Cassidy walked into the room. She was not wearing a faded Target sweater or worn-out jeans. She wore a $3,000 razor-sharp tailored charcoal power suit. Her hair was styled with effortless precision, and her posture radiated absolute terrifying authority. She was flanked by David, her ruthlessly calm wealth management attorney, and a second corporate litigator who carried a stack of thick leather-bound folders. Richard stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floor, his face contorted into an ugly, condescending sneer. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the glass room. "Did you get a second job bringing coffee to the executives? Get out of here right now before you embarrass us in front of the principal director." Cassidy did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She walked calmly to the head of the oak table directly opposite her father and stood perfectly still. She offered a cold, razor-thin smile. "I am not the secretary," she said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. She nodded to David. The attorney stepped forward and dropped the massive stack of deeds, loan papers, and default notices onto the center of the table with a deafening thud. "I am the owner of this house you live in, Cassidy," stated, looking dead into Richard's widening eyes. "And I am the principal director of the fund you just defaulted on." Absolute suffocating paralysis descended upon the room. The air was sucked out of their lungs. Brittany literally stopped breathing, her manicured hands freezing on the handle of her empty bag. Jamal's eyes bugged out of his head, his jaw slackening as his mind desperately tried to process the impossible. Patricia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. What? Patricia stammered, her voice shaking violently. "That is impossible. You work in a dusty warehouse. You push boxes. You do not have this kind of money." "I own the warehouse," Cassidy corrected smoothly. "500,000 square feet of it. I employ 200 people. I generate millions in revenue each quarter, and for the last 4 years I have owned you." Cassidy picked up a silver remote from the table and clicked a single button. The massive presentation screen at the far end of the boardroom flickered to life. High-definition video filled the display, accompanied by crystal-clear audio. It was the video Aunt Carol had sent. The room was forced to watch themselves on a 10-foot screen. They watched Patricia lean back with a crystal flute of champagne. They heard her voice boom through the boardroom speakers. "She is a pathetic failure. I honestly do not know where she came from. She has absolutely zero ambition. We should honestly start charging her an admission fee just to sit at our table. Maybe $2,000 a month." The video ended with their cruel, unified laughter. Cassidy clicked the screen to black. "I funded your arrogance," Cassidy said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a surgical scalpel. "I paid the mortgage on that pristine suburban estate. I leased your matching Mercedes SUVs. I subsidized the vintage champagne you were drinking, while you mocked my clothes, my car, and my career. I financed the illusion of your wealth because I naively believed that somewhere beneath your toxic vanity, you were my family. But you cured me of that delusion. The gravy train is officially over. Jamal tried to stand his chest heaving as panic completely overtook him. Cassidy, listen, we are family. We can work this out. The real estate market is just tight right now. If you just give me a 30-day extension, I can. Cassidy picked up a stark red folder from the top of the stack and slid it across the polished oak table directly toward Jamal. I am not interested in your excuses, Jamal, Cassidy interrupted, because the FBI is currently reviewing the contents of that folder. Jamal looked down at the red folder as if it were a live grenade. You did not just steal from a bank, Cassidy explained methodically. You forged my father's signature to secure a secondary home equity loan against a property that my LLC legally owns. You committed federal wire fraud and tied it directly to my corporate assets. My attorneys handed the complete dossier to the federal authorities yesterday morning. Patricia shrieked, burying her face in her hands. Richard clutched his chest, sinking back into his heavy leather chair as the reality of his utter ruin washed over him. Brittany began to sob hysterically, the exact same dramatic performance she used at Thanksgiving, but this time there was no audience left to manipulate. You are a monster! Brittany screamed through her tears, pointing a shaking finger at Cassidy. How can you do this to your own parents? How can you destroy my husband? You are ruining our lives out of pure spite. I did not forge the signatures, Cassidy replied effortlessly. I did not max out the credit cards on spa days and designer clothes. I did not force you to live wildly beyond your means. I simply stopped paying for your choices. The eviction executes today at 5 o'clock. The sheriff's deputies are already scheduled to arrive at the estate. I strongly suggest you spend the next few hours packing whatever fits into garbage bags because the locks are being changed tonight. Cassidy turned to her lawyers, signaling that the meeting was over. She did not wait for their apologies. She did not listen to their sudden, desperate begging. She walked out of the glass boardroom, the heavy doors clicking shut behind her, sealing her family inside the tomb of their own making. The brutal karma executed with flawless precision. By 5 o'clock that evening, the flashing lights of police cruisers illuminated the perfectly manicured driveway of the suburban estate. Richard and Patricia were physically escorted off the property by armed deputies. The wealthy neighbors stood on their porches, watching the final, undeniable collapse of the neighborhood's most arrogant couple. With their bank accounts frozen and their credit destroyed, Richard and Patricia were forced to move into a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment in an industrial neighborhood they previously would not even drive through. Jamal's reckoning came 3 days later. Federal agents arrived at that same run-down apartment and walked him out in handcuffs. The forged signatures and the magnitude of the wire fraud carried mandatory minimum sentencing. Brittany's influencer career imploded instantly. Someone from the country club leaked the foreclosure notices and the repossession photos to a local gossip blog. Her sponsors dropped her overnight. Stripped of her wealth, her fake luxury lifestyle, and her fraudulent husband Brittany filed for divorce in absolute disgrace, trapping herself in that tiny apartment with her miserable, ruined parents. Over the next 6 months, Cassidy's corporate legal team received hundreds of letters. They were handwritten, tear-stained pleas, begging for forgiveness, demanding family loyalty, and asking for just one more financial favor. We are blood, her mother wrote in one frantic letter. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Please, we have nothing. David, following Cassidy's strict instructions, returned every single envelope unopened, stamped with a bold red return to sender. Cassidy stood on the steel catwalk of her fulfillment center, looking down at the roaring machinery of her empire. The noise of the conveyor belts and the heavy machinery was a beautiful, comforting symphony. She rested her hands on the cold steel railing, breathing in the scent of cardboard and diesel fuel. Society constantly demands that women be the bigger person. The world expects daughters to absorb the poison of toxic families and label it as loyalty. People are conditioned to set themselves on fire just to keep their abusers warm. Cassidy rejected that narrative entirely. She refused to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of her parents' ego. She had reclaimed her life, her money, and her peace. She watched a fleet of massive delivery trucks roll out of the loading bays, carrying her success out into the world. Her life was quiet, fiercely independent, and wildly successful. She finally understood that family is not the blood that drains you. Family is the people who respect you, who uplift you, and who never require you to buy your seat at their table. The best investment I ever made was cutting off their funding, Cassidy said quietly to herself. She reached into her pocket, turned off her phone, smiled at the bustling warehouse below, and walked back to her office to get back to work. The 5th of November arrived with a bitter chill that swept off Lake Michigan, but the real freeze was happening deep within the digital servers of the banking systems. At exactly midnight, the final grace period for the Vanguard Limited Liability Company accounts officially expired. For 4 years, those accounts had acted as a silent, impenetrable fortress protecting my family from their own reckless greed. Now the fortress was gone. The automated clearinghouse transfers were canceled. The credit lines were instantly frozen due to severe delinquency. The financial guillotine had dropped, and my sister Brittany was completely oblivious, preparing to place her neck squarely on the chopping block. At 2 in the afternoon, Brittany was lounging in a plush monogrammed robe at an ultra-luxury wellness retreat in downtown Chicago. She was holding court with 2 of her wealthy socialite friends, Madison and Taylor. Brittany had spent the entire morning treating them to the most expensive services the facility offered. They had indulged in pure gold leaf facials, hot stone deep tissue massages, and imported champagne pedicures. Brittany viewed these outings as essential investments for her influencer lifestyle brand. She believed that projecting an image of limitless wealth was the only way to maintain her status among women who actually possessed real money. "You really have to spend money to make money," Brittany bragged, sipping a glass of cucumber-infused water as they lounged in the relaxation room. "Jamal always tells me that my aesthetic is our best marketing tool. He is closing another massive commercial property deal next week, so I figured we all deserved a little pampering today." "Do not even worry about the bill, girls. This entire day is on me." Madison and Taylor exchanged a polite, polished smile. They were old money, the kind of women who never explicitly talked about price tags, which made Brittany's constant bragging incredibly tacky. Still, they were more than happy to let her pick up the tab. The 3 women changed back into their designer clothes and strolled toward the grand marble reception desk. The spa interior was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury, filled with the scent of eucalyptus and the soft sound of ambient music. A perfectly groomed receptionist stood behind the counter, typing efficiently at a sleek computer terminal. "Checking out for Brittany," my sister announced, leaning against the marble counter with a practiced, arrogant posture. She reached into her quilted leather handbag and retrieved a heavy metal credit card. It was the card directly linked to the joint account my company had been secretly funding. She slid it across the cool marble with a smug flourish. "Of course," the receptionist said, offering a warm, professional smile. "I hope you and your guests enjoyed your treatments today. Your total comes to $1,540. Brittany did not even blink at the number. She simply waved her hand dismissively, waiting for the familiar sound of an approved transaction so she could bask in the admiration of her friends. The receptionist inserted the heavy metal card into the terminal. The machine emitted a harsh, jarring beep. It was a sharp, ugly sound that completely shattered the serene atmosphere of the lobby. The receptionist frowned slightly, pulling the card out and inspecting the chip. "I am sorry, ma'am. It seems the card was declined. Let me just try running it again. Sometimes the connection is a bit slow." Brittany scoffed, loudly, rolling her eyes and looking back at Madison and Taylor. "Your machine is obviously broken," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea what the limit is on that account?" "Just run it again." The receptionist swiped the card a second time. Another loud, aggressive beep echoed through the lobby. A red light flashed on the terminal screen. "I apologize, ma'am," the receptionist said, her professional warmth dropping a few degrees. "The terminal is displaying a message from your bank. The account has been frozen due to severe delinquency. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" Brittany's face burned a violent shade of crimson. She could feel the eyes of her friends burning into the back of her head. Panic began to claw at her throat, but her narcissism quickly overrode her logic. "That is impossible!" Brittany snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "My husband is a top-tier real estate broker. There are hundreds of thousands of dollars in that account. Your system is making a mistake." She snatched her purse and frantically dug through it, pulling out a different card. This one was tied to Jamal's supposed business account. She slapped the plastic onto the marble counter. "Run this one, and I expect a serious apology from your manager for this embarrassment." The receptionist picked up the second card with a tight, unamused expression. She inserted it into the machine. "Beep. Declined." "Ma'am," the receptionist said, her voice now completely devoid of any customer service pretense. "This card is also declining for insufficient funds. I need a valid form of payment for the services rendered today." The ambient music in the lobby suddenly felt deafening. Madison and Taylor took a collective step back, distancing themselves from the radioactive humiliation radiating off my sister. Brittany went into a complete meltdown. She slammed both of her hands down on the marble counter, leaning over it to scream directly into the receptionist's face. "Do you know who I am? I have over 100,000 followers. I will destroy this spa. I will post about how your fraudulent machines steal from clients and embarrass them. Get your manager out here right now." The spa manager, who had been observing the commotion from a nearby glass office, walked out immediately. She did not look intimidated. She looked furious. "Ma'am, lower your voice immediately or I will have security escort you out," the manager warned coldly. "You have received over $1,500 in premium services. If you cannot produce a working credit card right now, I am calling the police to report a theft of services." Brittany froze, the threat of police involvement instantly piercing through her hysterical rage. She looked back at Madison and Taylor, her eyes wide with desperate pleading. Madison let out a heavy, disappointed sigh. She opened her own purse, pulled out a sleek black card, and handed it to the manager. "Put it on mine," Madison said quietly. Taylor looked at Brittany with an expression of absolute disgust and pity. The ultimate social death sentence. "Let us go," Madison Taylor muttered. "I think Brittany needs to figure out her financial situation before she invites us out again." The two women paid the bill and walked out the glass doors, leaving Brittany standing alone at the reception desk. Her carefully curated influencer facade had just been incinerated in front of the exact people she was trying to impress. Brittany stumbled out of the spa and into the freezing Chicago wind. She was shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air as she rushed down the sidewalk. Her mind scrambled to find a target for her rage, and as always, it landed on me. She pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers trembling as she pulled up my contact information. In her warped, delusional mind, she was convinced that I had simply forgotten to transfer the $2,000 family tax they had demanded at Thanksgiving. She was preparing to scream at me, to blame me for her humiliation, and to order me to wire money into her account immediately. She pressed the call button and pressed the phone to her ear. Instead of a ringing tone, she was met with a stark, automated voice. "The number you are trying to reach is currently unavailable." Brittany stopped walking. She pulled the phone away from her ear and stared at the screen. She opened her text messages and sent an angry, expletive-filled paragraph demanding I answer the phone. A red exclamation point appeared next to the text, "Not delivered." Panic turning into absolute terror, she opened Instagram and searched for my profile. User not found. She opened Facebook. Profile unavailable. She stood frozen on the busy downtown sidewalk as the horrific reality finally began to sink in. She had been completely, unequivocally blocked on every single platform. The pathetic failure she relied on to absorb her abuse was entirely unreachable, and her bank accounts were completely dry. Brittany practically sprinted the 2 blocks to the luxury hotel where she had valeted her leased black Mercedes SUV. Her lungs burned with the freezing Chicago air, but the cold was nothing compared to the icy terror gripping her chest. When the valet brought her car around, she dug frantically through her quilted handbag, bypassing the useless plastic cards until her trembling fingers found a crumpled $20 bill. She thrust it at the attendant without a word and threw herself into the driver's seat. She sped all the way back to the sprawling suburban mansion they rented. The massive house sat at the end of a pristine cul-de-sac, a towering monument to their fake success. For the first time, looking at the grand pillars and the sweeping driveway did not fill Brittany with pride. It filled her with a suffocating dread. She burst through the heavy double doors. Jamal was lounging on the custom Italian leather sofa in the living room, wearing his silk pajamas in the middle of the afternoon. He was casually practicing his golf putt on the Persian rug, an unlit imported cigar hanging from his mouth. "Get your computer right now!" Brittany screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Open the bank accounts, all of them!" Jamal did not even flinch. He just rolled his eyes and took another slow practice swing. "Relax, babe. You are being hysterical." So a piece of plastic got a fraud alert. It happens to high net worth individuals all the time. The bank probably flagged it because you were spending too fast. "It was not a fraud alert," Brittany shrieked, kicking off her designer heels and marching across the rug. "Madison had to pay for my facial. I was humiliated in front of everyone. I tried to call Cassidy to get our allowance and she blocked me. She blocked my number, my Instagram, everything. Open the damn portal." Jamal finally lowered his golf club, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face. He walked over to the home bar, grabbed his sleek silver laptop, and flipped it open on the kitchen island. He typed in his credentials with an arrogant smirk, fully expecting to show his wife a screen full of comfortable numbers. He hit enter. The dashboard loaded. The smirk melted off his face instantly. He blinked hard, leaning closer to the high-definition screen, as if his eyes were deceiving him. Instead of the massive credit limits and the comfortable cash cushion they were accustomed to, the screen was a bloodbath of red text and warning icons. Every single credit card was maxed out and frozen. The joint checking account, which usually held the automatic deposits from the anonymous limited liability company they thought was Jamal's brokerage backing, showed a balance of exactly $42.16. "This makes no sense," Jamal muttered, his hands suddenly shaking as he clicked frantically through the transaction history. The automated clearinghouse transfer was supposed to hit yesterday. "Where is the deposit?" He opened the corporate backing file. The screen displayed a stark, unfeeling message. "Account access terminated by principal director. Grace period expired." The anonymous safety net was gone. The mysterious entity that had paid their rent, funded their cars, and covered their massive overhead had simply unplugged them from the machine. "Call them!" Brittany gasped, clutching the edge of the marble island to keep her legs from giving out. "Call your brokerage. Call whoever runs that fund." "I do not have a direct number," Jamal yelled, his arrogant facade completely shattering. It was a blind trust. It was set up through a third-party management firm. They just handled the disbursements as long as I submitted the invoices. "You told me you were a top-tier broker," Brittany cried, her voice cracking. "You said this was your executive expense account. You said you earned this." "I do close deals," Jamal roared defensively, though his panicked eyes told a completely different story. "The market is just transitioning. I needed capital to float us while I line up my next commercial project." They stared at the screen, the horrific reality crashing down on them. They were 30 years old, living in a house that cost $10,000 a month to rent, driving 2 cars that cost $3,000 a month to lease, and they had exactly $42 to their name. They could not even afford to order a premium pizza for dinner, let alone maintain the illusion of being Chicago elites. Brittany could not breathe. The walls of the massive kitchen felt like they were closing in to crush her. She turned and ran up the sweeping, curved staircase, fleeing into her massive, custom-built walk-in closet. She slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the plush white carpet, surrounded by walls of designer handbags and row upon row of red-bottom shoes. None of it was paid for. All of it was financed by the very sister she had just spent the last 24 hours mocking. But the narcissism of an influencer runs deeper than basic survival instincts. Even as her world burned to the ground, Brittany's first thought was her public image. She could not let Madison Taylor or her 100,000 followers know she was broke. With trembling hands, she reached up and dragged her professional ring light to the center of the closet. She clicked it on, bathing the room in a flawless, bright white glow. She grabbed a tissue, fiercely wiping away the ruined mascara from her cheeks. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her facial muscles into a bright, manic smile. She opened the Instagram app and hit record. "Hey guys," Brittany chirped, her voice falsely sweet and energetic. "I just got back from the most amazing exclusive spa day downtown." Seriously, taking time for self-care is so important when you are managing a luxury brand. Jamal and I are just so incredibly blessed. I am looking at all these beautiful pieces in my closet, and I am thinking it is time for a massive wardrobe refresh. Stay tuned for a huge designer haul next week. She hit post. The video uploaded to the internet, adding another layer of absolute delusion to her crumbling life. The second the upload finished, the fake smile dropped. Brittany let the phone slip from her fingers. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and began to hyperventilate. The panic attacks came in violent waves, racking her body with violent sobs. She sat alone in the bright artificial light of her closet, surrounded by fake wealth, completely paralyzed by the terror of her impending poverty. Hours passed. The sun set, plunging the massive rented house into freezing darkness. Jamal had locked himself in the home office, desperately trying to call any loan shark or predatory lender who would answer the phone. Brittany remained on the floor of her closet, too terrified to move. It was shortly past midnight. The neighborhood was dead silent, the kind of absolute quiet only found in exclusive gated communities. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive banging echoed from the heavy mahogany front doors, shaking the entire house. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive banging echoed from the heavy mahogany front doors, shaking the entire house. Jamal nearly jumped out of his skin. He had been hunched over his sleek silver laptop in the dark home office, frantically dialing predatory loan agencies and getting nothing but immediate rejections. The booming knocks reverberated through the empty cavernous foyer, followed instantly by the harsh mechanical grinding of heavy machinery. Rhythmic flashes of intense amber light began sweeping across the living room walls, casting long, distorted shadows through the massive front windows. Jamal scrambled out of the office, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He sprinted toward the grand entrance, his bare feet slipping slightly on the polished marble. He unlocked the deadbolt and threw the double doors wide open. The freezing Chicago wind hit him like a physical blow, but the cold was absolutely nothing compared to the paralyzing shock of the scene unfolding on his pristine paver stone driveway. Two massive heavy-duty tow trucks were backed directly up to the garage. Four men wearing thick industrial winter coats and high-visibility yellow vests were moving with ruthless, practiced efficiency. They were already ratcheting thick steel chains around the axles of Jamal's gleaming black Mercedes G-Wagon and Brittany's matching Mercedes AMG Coupe. The hydraulic winches whined loudly, lifting the front tires of the luxury vehicles off the ground. "Hey!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He sprinted out into the freezing November night, wearing nothing but his thin silk pajamas and designer loafers. "Stop what you are doing right now! Get your hands off my cars!" The men did not even pause. They continued securing the heavy metal hooks, the loud clanking metal echoing through the dead silent exclusive neighborhood. "I said stop!" Jamal roared, stepping aggressively toward the closest tow truck. "This is a massive banking error. I am a top-tier real estate broker in this city. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Unhook those vehicles before I call the police and have you all arrested for grand theft auto." The lead recovery agent, a man built like a brick wall with a thick gray beard, calmly stepped out from behind the G-Wagon. He did not look intimidated in the slightest. He pulled a heavy metal clipboard from his jacket and clicked on a tactical flashlight, shining the blinding white beam directly into Jamal's panicked face. "There is no error, sir," the agent stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "Your lender ordered an immediate repossession due to severe delinquency. The final grace period expired at midnight. These vehicles belong to the bank now." Jamal threw his hands up, desperately trying to maintain his alpha male facade while shivering violently in the freezing wind. "You do not understand. My brokerage handles these payments through a blind corporate trust. The automated transfer was delayed by a holiday weekend. I can write you a check right now to cover the gap. Just unhook the cars." The agent lowered the flashlight and handed Jamal a thick stack of aggressively stapled default notices. "We do not take checks, buddy, and we do not care about your brokerage." The anonymous backer on this account terminated the agreement. Your credit line is frozen, and the balance is severely past due. Now I need you to step back from the recovery equipment. If you interfere with a lawful repossession, my dispatch is instructed to immediately send local law enforcement to facilitate the seizure. The threat of police arriving with sirens blaring completely broke Jamal. His arrogant bravado instantly evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, shivering man in silk pajamas, holding a stack of worthless paper. The heavy front doors of the mansion creaked open. Brittany stumbled out onto the front porch, clutching her designer robe tightly around her waist. Her makeup was still ruined from her closet meltdown. She stared in absolute horror as the hydraulic lifts engaged, pulling her beloved AMG coupe onto the flatbed of the second tow truck. "Jamal, do something!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing loudly across the cul-de-sac. "They are taking our cars. You said you had money. You said you fixed this." Jamal could not look at her. He could not look at the repo men. He could only stare at the ground as the ultimate social death sentence was executed. Across the street, exterior porch lights began flipping on one by one. The heavy, expensive curtains of the neighboring mansions twitched. The actual wealthy residents of the gated community, the surgeons, corporate executives, and real estate developers who actually owned their homes, were standing at their windows. They were watching the spectacular, undeniable downfall of the loud, flashy couple they had always secretly despised. The neighborhood was bearing witness to the exposure of a complete fraud. The diesel engines of the tow trucks roared to life, spewing thick clouds of exhaust into the freezing air. The agents climbed into their cabs and slammed the heavy doors shut. Without another word, the two massive trucks pulled out of the driveway, the amber lights flashing mockingly as they carried the physical proof of Jamal and Brittany's fake wealth down the street and out of sight. The driveway was completely empty, save for a few dark streaks of grease and the harsh scrape marks left by the tires. Brittany collapsed against the stone pillar of the porch, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her entire identity, her influencer status, her elite social standing was gone. She was trapped in the suburbs with no transportation, no money, and a husband who was a complete and utter liar. Jamal stood frozen on the freezing asphalt. The winter wind ripped right through his thin silk pajamas, chilling him to the bone, but he barely registered the physical pain. His mind was racing through a terrifying, inescapable reality. The anonymous angel investor was gone. The bank accounts were drained. The cars were repossessed. And tomorrow morning the massive rent payment on the mansion would be due. He clutched the stack of default notices in his trembling hands. The facade was thoroughly and completely destroyed. He could no longer hide behind fake confidence or leased luxury items. He had absolutely nothing left. A fresh wave of nausea hit him as a much darker, far more terrifying thought crossed his mind. The missing car payments were just the beginning. The anonymous LLC had also been covering the massive secondary mortgage he had taken out to fund his fake lifestyle. The secondary mortgage he had secured by forging his father-in-law's signature. Jamal turned back to look at the massive, echoing, empty mansion. He realized with absolute dread that the financial guillotine had only just begun to fall. He was out of options, out of time, and out of other people's money. He realized that as soon as the sun came up, he had to go to Richard and Patricia's house. He had to look his arrogant status, obsessed in-laws in the eye and admit that they were completely, utterly broke. He had to tell them that the lavish lifestyle they enjoyed was gone forever, and worst of all, he had to confess that his desperate, illegal financial crimes were about to drag them all down with him. Jamal slammed the heavy mahogany doors shut, locking out the freezing wind, but the chill inside his chest only deepened. He left Brittany sobbing on the porch and sprinted back into his dark home office. His hands shook so violently he could barely unlock his phone. He dug through his desk drawers, tearing through manicured files until he found an old invoice from the management firm that handled their blind trust. He punched in the toll-free number, his breath hitching in his throat. The line rang once, followed by a sharp synthetic click. "Welcome to Vanguard Financial Holdings," a crisp, automated female voice announced. "Please enter your 9-digit account routing number." Jamal typed the numbers frantically, messing up the final digit and cursing loudly before restarting the process. Finally, the system registered his input. Account located, the robotic voice stated flatly. Please be advised this account has been flagged for critical intervention. The primary benefactor has terminated all scheduled disbursements. Your portfolio is currently in severe default. All associated credit lines have been permanently closed, and the outstanding balance has been transferred to a third-party collections agency. If you wish to make a payment in full, press 1. To hear this message again, press 2. I need to speak to a representative. Jamal screamed into the receiver, slamming his fist against the desk. Press 0. Give me an operator. He mashed the keypad, desperate for a human voice, someone he could charm, threaten, or manipulate. But the machine was indifferent to his panic. We are sorry. The automated voice continued, entirely unbothered. Live representatives are not authorized to override benefactor termination protocols. Goodbye. The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in Jamal's ear like a flat line on a heart monitor. He threw the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the custom bookshelves. There was no glitch. There was no delay. The money was simply gone, and whoever had been pulling the strings had vanished into thin air. A sudden piercing shriek from the hallway snapped Jamal out of his paralysis. He stormed out of the office and found Brittany standing in the grand foyer. She had finally come inside, her expensive silk robe soaked with freezing rain, clutching her empty designer handbag like a life preserver. "Fix this!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the marble tiles. "Call your brokers. Call your billionaire investors. You are supposed to be a mogul, Jamal. You promised me this lifestyle." The sheer entitlement radiating from her instantly ignited a blinding rage inside Jamal. He marched across the foyer and got right in her face, completely abandoning the polished, loving husband persona he presented to the world. "Shut your mouth!" Jamal roared, his voice booming with venom. "There are no investors, Brittany. The money is gone, do you hear me? Gone, and this is your fault." "And this? My fault?" Brittany gasped, stumbling back against the sweeping staircase. "You are the provider. You handle the finances. I handled keeping this fake reality afloat while you bled us dry." Jamal spat, pointing an accusing finger at her tear-streaked face. "Do you have any idea how much money you burned through this year? $20,000 a month on clothes you wear once for a picture? $10,000 on luxury vacations with your fake friends? You spent $1,500 at a spa yesterday while our bank accounts were bleeding out. You are a financial parasite." Brittany's eyes widened in furious disbelief. She dropped her handbag and stepped right back into his space. "Do not you dare put this on me, you absolute fraud. I built a brand. I brought status to this marriage. What exactly did you bring? You strut around in velvet blazers handing out business cards, but you have not closed a single real estate deal in 12 months. You play golf on a membership you cannot afford, and buy fake Rolex watches to impress men who laugh behind your back. You are nothing but a broke, desperate imposter who used my family's name to get into the country club." The brutal, unfiltered truth hung in the freezing air between them. The toxic foundation of their marriage was entirely exposed. They did not love each other. They loved the illusion of wealth they provided for one another, and now that the illusion was shattered, there was nothing left but resentment and disgust. "I did what I had to do to survive your insatiable greed," Jamal fired back, his voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "You want to talk about your family's name? Your precious family is going down with us. I used your father's name to secure the secondary loan on this house. I forged his signature because you demanded a lifestyle I could not fund. When the bank audits those papers, your father loses his estate and I go to federal prison. So do not stand there acting like a victim. We are both going to drown." Brittany collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, the gravity of his confession physically crushing her. Her husband was a felon, and her parents were about to lose everything. The influencer empire she had built was entirely worthless. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the damp silk of her robe. Jamal did not comfort her. He turned his back, staring blankly at the empty driveway through the frosted glass of the front door. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light over their ruined lives. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, in the affluent gated suburbs of Chicago, Richard and Patricia were completely oblivious to the catastrophic storm racing toward their doorstep. The morning broke crisp and clear over their sprawling, custom-built colonial estate. Patricia was sitting in her sun-drenched breakfast nook, wearing a cashmere sweater and sipping a perfectly brewed cup of imported espresso. She was casually flipping through a luxury home decor catalog, mentally planning a $50,000 kitchen renovation she assumed the mysterious financial trust would seamlessly cover. Richard was in the master suite, knotting a bespoke silk tie and preparing for an early morning golf game with a local judge. In their minds, the world was exactly as it should be. They had successfully bullied Cassidy at Thanksgiving, reaffirming their dominance over their disappointing daughter, and their golden child was living the dream. They felt entirely secure, insulated by their perceived wealth and unbreakable social standing. Outside, the quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly down the pristine street, coming to a smooth stop directly in front of Richard and Patricia's wrought iron driveway gates. The vehicle was entirely unmarked with heavily tinted windows that offered no hint of who was inside. The driver killed the engine. A man in a cheap rumpled gray suit stepped out of the vehicle. He did not carry a clipboard or a delivery package. He carried a single thick manila envelope sealed with stark red tape. He bypassed the intercom system entirely, walking with purposeful mechanical strides up the long sweeping driveway toward the grand mahogany front doors of the estate. Patricia glanced up from her catalog, catching movement through the bay window. She frowned, annoyed that a common worker had bypassed the service entrance. She set her espresso cup down on the marble table, ready to deliver a harsh lecture to whoever dared interrupt her peaceful morning. She had no idea that the man walking up her steps was carrying a piece of paper that would instantly obliterate her entire reality. Patricia threw open the heavy mahogany front door, her face arranged in a mask of aristocratic fury. She was fully prepared to dress down this rumpled stranger for daring to bypass the service entrance of her multi-million-dollar estate. She opened her mouth to demand his immediate departure off her pristine driveway. "Are you Patricia or Richard?" The man in the gray suit interrupted flatly, not even looking up from a small digital device in his hand. Patricia bristled, pulling her cashmere sweater tightly around her shoulders. "I am the homeowner, and I want to know why you think you can simply march up to my front door without an appointment. Leave this property at once before I call the authorities." The man did not blink. He simply shoved the heavy red-taped manila envelope directly against her chest, forcing her to grab it to stop it from hitting the floor. "You have been served," he stated with mechanical indifference. He turned on his heel and walked briskly back down the driveway. He climbed into his unmarked SUV and drove away, leaving Patricia standing barefoot on the cold marble threshold. A deep, unsettling knot formed in her stomach. She stared at the thick envelope. The return address belonged to the major national bank that held their primary mortgage. With trembling fingers, she ripped through the red tape and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents. Bold black letters screamed across the very first page. "Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Immediate eviction proceedings initiated." Patricia felt the blood drain entirely from her face. Her eyes darted wildly across the dense legal jargon, catching terrifying phrases. Severe delinquency, non-payment, breach of contract, asset seizure. The anonymous financial entity that had silently floated their extravagant lifestyle for the past 4 years had completely vanished. The mortgage had not been paid. The final grace period was officially dead, and the bank was moving with ruthless speed to take the house. Her imported espresso cup slipped from her weakened grip. It hit the marble floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The dark, scalding liquid splashed across her expensive slippers and stained the pristine white grout. Patricia's knees buckled. She collapsed against the heavy wooden doorframe, her vision blurring, as a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She gasped for air, unable to pull oxygen into her lungs. The flawless, untouchable reality she had curated for decades was collapsing right in front of her eyes. Richard, Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. Richard, come here right now! Heavy footsteps pounded down the sweeping wooden staircase. Richard appeared in the foyer, half-dressed in his custom golf attire, gripping a silk tie in one hand. His face was flushed with irritation at having his morning routine interrupted. "What on earth are you yelling about?" Richard demanded, sidestepping the spilled coffee. "You are going to wake the neighbors." Patricia could not speak. She simply held up the crumpled legal documents, her hands shaking violently. Richard snatched the papers from her grip. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the top page. The color washed completely out of his face. His arrogant posture deflated in an instant, replaced by the sheer, unmistakable posture of a ruined man. "This is impossible," Richard muttered, flipping frantically through the pages. "This is a clerical error. The trust management firm handles this. They have always handled this." He abandoned Patricia on the floor and sprinted into his home office. He slammed the door shut and lunged for his desk phone. He dialed his private banker, a man he usually treated with smug condescension. When the banker finally answered, Richard dropped all pleasantries. "William, there is a massive mistake with my account," Richard barked, trying to inject authority into his trembling voice. "A process server just handed my wife a foreclosure notice. You need to call off your legal department right now and contact the LLC managing our trust." The banker's voice was ice cold. "There is no mistake, Richard. The principal director of the LLC contacted us directly. They have formally severed all ties with your accounts and terminated the backing agreement. We have zero legal standing to request funds from them. You are solely responsible for the debt, and you are hundreds of thousands of dollars in arrears. We are seizing the property." Richard felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "Listen to me, William. I am a prominent member of this community. You know my portfolio. Just give me a 90-day extension to liquidate some alternative assets. I cannot help you, Richard. The board reviewed your file this morning. Your credit is completely toxic. Have your lawyer contact our foreclosure department. Goodbye." The line went dead. Richard stared at the receiver in absolute horror. He hung up the phone and opened his leather-bound contact book. He was cornered, but his narcissism convinced him he could still charm his way out. He had spent decades building a network of wealthy, powerful friends at the country club. Judges, investment bankers, commercial developers. Surely one of them would float him a bridge loan to save his estate. He dialed his closest golf partner, a hedge fund manager who lived 3 streets over. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Richard left a frantic, overly friendly message asking for a quick callback regarding a highly lucrative temporary investment opportunity. He dialed another number, a corporate lawyer he had known for 20 years. The call connected, but the lawyer cut him off before Richard could even finish his pitch. "Richard, do not ask me for money," the lawyer stated bluntly. Richard choked on his words. "What, I just have a temporary liquidity issue. It is a minor cash flow overlap." "Save the script," the lawyer replied, his tone dripping with disgust. "Everyone at the club already knows. Someone from the repo company leaked the photos of your son-in-law's cars getting towed last night. We know the bank is coming for your house today. You are completely broke, Richard. Do not ever call this number again." The line clicked shut. Richard sat frozen in his plush leather chair. The truth hit him with the force of a freight train. The gossip mill in their affluent suburb moved faster than light. The wealthy elites they had spent their entire lives trying to impress had already turned on them. They were no longer the prestigious, enviable power couple of the neighborhood. They were pariahs. They were a cautionary tale. They were toxic waste. He dialed 5 more numbers in rapid succession. Every single call went straight to voicemail. His numbers had been actively blocked by the very people who had drank his expensive scotch just a week prior. Richard slowly lowered the phone to the desk. The silence in the house was deafening. He looked out the large office window at the pristine manicured lawn he had always been so proud to display. It no longer belonged to him. The luxury, the status, the sheer arrogance of his existence had been completely eradicated. The door to the office creaked open. Patricia stood in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with mascara. "Jamal and Brittany just pulled up in a taxi." Patricia whispered, her voice completely hollow. They lost the cars. They have absolutely no money. Richard buried his face in his hands. The walls were closing and the oxygen rapidly depleting from their fake empire. In their absolute desperation, their twisted narcissistic minds began searching frantically for a way out, and inevitably their thoughts locked onto the one person they had always used to absorb their failures. Patricia stepped aside as the heavy front doors swung open. Jamal and Brittany stumbled into the grand foyer completely stripped of their usual arrogance. Brittany was still wearing her damp silk robe over yoga pants, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from hours of hysterical crying. Jamal trailed behind her, clutching a plastic shopping bag containing the few personal items he had managed to snatch from their repossessed luxury vehicles. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the grand foyer like a trapped animal. Richard walked slowly out of his office, gripping the foreclosure notice in his hand. The four of them stood in the center of the massive echoing space surrounded by crystal chandeliers and imported artwork that none of them actually owned. The silence was suffocating. For the first time in their lives, the facade was completely shattered. There were no country club friends to impress. There were no Instagram followers to envy them. There was only the cold, hard reality of absolute financial ruin. "They took my cars!" Jamal blurted out, his voice cracking with panic. "The bank took both of the Mercedes. The anonymous trust account is entirely gone. They locked us out of the banking portals. We have absolutely nothing left." Richard threw the foreclosure documents onto the marble floor. It scattered across the pristine tiles. "The bank is taking this house," Richard shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "The management firm canceled the backing agreement. My private banker basically laughed in my face. The entire neighborhood knows. We are completely ruined." Brittany collapsed onto the bottom step of the sweeping staircase, burying her face in her hands. "This cannot be happening," she sobbed, rocking back and forth. "I have brand deals lined up. I have a reputation. How am I supposed to create luxury content when I do not even have a car? We are going to be homeless." In a rational family, this would be the moment of reckoning. This would be the time to sit down, look at their insurmountable credit card debt, their completely unnecessary luxury purchases, and admit that their own greed had destroyed them. But this family was entirely incapable of self-reflection. Their narcissistic minds functioned like defensive fortresses, instantly deflecting any personal accountability. They desperately needed someone to blame someone, to absorb the consequences of their catastrophic failures. And like clockwork, their twisted logic locked directly onto their favorite target. "This is all Cassidy's fault," Richard declared, suddenly pacing across the foyer. The sheer absurdity of the statement should have stopped the conversation dead. But in this house of delusion, it was the exact lifeline they all needed. "Think about it," Richard continued, his voice gaining frantic momentum. "If Cassidy had just liquidated her retirement accounts at Thanksgiving, like we demanded, we would have had the liquid cash to float these accounts. We could have bridged the gap. We could have shown the management firm that we had capital. She knew we needed financial support, and she selfishly kept her money to herself." Patricia seized onto the narrative with absolute desperation. She wiped her ruined makeup and nodded vigorously. "Yes, exactly. She saw us struggling, and she walked right out the door. She did this to us intentionally. After everything we have done to tolerate her miserable presence in this family, she stabs us in the back. She is an incredibly selfish, bitter girl. She probably hopes we lose everything just because she is jealous of Brittany's success." Brittany lifted her head from her hands, her eyes flashing with renewed, misplaced anger. "She always ruins everything," Brittany hissed. "She ruined Thanksgiving, and now she is ruining our lives. If she had just handed over her savings, my cars would still be in the driveway. She owes us." Jamal, whose panic was reaching a boiling point over the forged secondary mortgage he had secretly taken out in Richard's name, saw an opportunity to save himself. He desperately needed a massive infusion of cash to pay off the secondary lender before the federal authorities were notified of his forgery. "She has a stable job," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory pitch. "She works full-time at that massive logistics center down by the industrial park. She might not have a fancy title, but she has steady income and a clean credit score. She can take out a personal loan. Richard stopped pacing. He looked at Jamal, the gears turning in his desperate mind. A personal signature loan. She could easily get approved for $50,000 or $60,000 if she leverages her retirement accounts. That would be enough to halt the foreclosure proceedings and get the repo agencies off our backs. But she will never agree to it, Patricia argued, crossing her arms defensively. You saw how arrogant she was at dinner. She blocked all our numbers. She will just refuse. Jamal scoffed, a dark, ugly sneer forming on his face. She will agree if we do not give her a choice. We do not ask her over the phone. We go to her workplace. Tomorrow morning, we find her manager. We embarrass her in front of her entire department. We make a massive public scene until she agrees to sign the loan applications just to make us leave. Patricia's eyes lit up at the prospect of publicly humiliating the daughter she despised. She works in a warehouse. She is probably just a floor clerk or an inventory counter. Her supervisors will not tolerate a family disturbance on the warehouse floor. If we threaten her job security, she will fold immediately. She has always been weak when we apply real pressure. The plan galvanized the room. The sheer panic of their impending poverty was temporarily masked by the thrill of bullying their designated scapegoat. They genuinely believed that Cassidy was nothing but a fragile, low-level employee who could be easily intimidated into signing away her financial future. I will rent a car right now, Jamal stated, pulling out his phone. I still have one business credit card that might have a few $100s of available limit left. I will get a cheap rental and we will drive down to that logistics center the second they open for the morning shift. Richard nodded firmly, straightening his posture as if he were still a powerful executive and not a man days away from eviction. We do not leave that building until she transfers the funds. She owes this family. It is time she finally paid her dues. They gathered their coats and began plotting their ambush, entirely convinced of their own supremacy. They believed they were going to march into a dusty warehouse and force a pathetic clerk into submission. They had absolutely no idea that the logistics center was a multi-million-dollar empire, and they were about to walk straight into the jaws of the very predator that had already swallowed them whole. The freezing morning wind whipped across the massive industrial park as a dented, rented silver Kia Optima sputtered into the visitor parking lot. Jamal slammed the car into park, his knuckles white as he gripped the cheap plastic steering wheel. He glared through the windshield at the structure looming in front of them. This was not the dusty, run-down storage shed they had pictured. The logistics center was a colossal 500,000-square-foot fortress of modern commerce. A towering wall of tinted glass formed the main corporate entrance, flanked by perfectly manicured landscaping. Down the side of the massive facility, a relentless, perfectly choreographed line of 18-wheeler trucks backed into dozens of loading docks. The sheer scale of the operation hummed with raw financial power. Brittany stepped out of the passenger side, pulling her faux fur coat tightly around her trembling shoulders. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, a desperate attempt to hide her red, swollen eyes. Jamal marched around the hood of the cheap rental car, his velvet blazer completely inadequate for the Chicago chill. He threw his shoulders back, trying to summon the arrogant swagger of the wealthy mogul he pretended to be. They stormed toward the sleek, sliding glass doors. Jamal fully intended to march straight onto the warehouse floor, grab his sister-in-law by the arm, and drag her to the nearest bank. He believed he was walking into a lowly blue-collar workspace where his presence would command immediate submission. The sliding doors parted with a quiet swoosh. Jamal and Brittany strode into the lobby and immediately froze. This was no dusty warehouse floor. The grand atrium featured polished concrete floors, soaring 30-foot ceilings, and a massive living green wall. Behind a sleek, curved reception desk stood two professionals in tailored suits, answering multi-line phone systems with quiet efficiency. Jamal swallowed hard, his confidence taking a momentary hit, but his desperation quickly overrode his logic. He marched directly up to the reception desk and slammed his palm flat against the polished surface. "I need you to go to the back and fetch Cassidy," Jamal demanded, his voice obnoxiously loud in the quiet professional space. "She is an inventory clerk here. Tell her it is a family emergency and her sister needs her out here right now." The receptionist stopped typing and looked up, her expression a mix of polite confusion and mild annoyance. Excuse me, sir, I do not have anyone listed as an inventory clerk by that name in the corporate directory. Do you have an appointment? I do not need an appointment to see a box pusher. Jamal snapped, leaning aggressively over the counter. Go find her manager. Tell them her family is here to pick her up for a personal emergency. Now. Before the receptionist could press the silent alarm beneath her desk, a massive figure stepped out from the shadows of the security alcove. Donovan, the head of corporate security, moved with the silent, lethal grace of a former military contractor. He was built like a tank, wearing a perfectly fitted dark suit with an earpiece coiled neatly behind his ear. Sir, I am going to need you to step back from the desk immediately. Donovan stated, his voice, a deep, resonant rumble that commanded instant obedience. We do not have inventory clerks that take unannounced personal visits in the middle of a shift. If you do not have a scheduled appointment, you need to exit the premises. Brittany ripped off her oversized sunglasses, her face twisting into a mask of pure entitlement. You do not understand. We are her family. She works in the back. Tell her supervisor that Brittany is here and she needs to come out to the lobby this second. Donovan crossed his massive arms over his chest. He looked at Brittany, then at Jamal, completely unfazed by their temper tantrums. Lady, I do not care who you think you are. The person you are asking for does not take walk-in appointments. Now return to your vehicle before I have you officially trespassed from this property. Jamal puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively toward the security director. He tried to summon the intimidation tactics he used on desperate homebuyers. Do you know who I am? I am a top-tier real estate broker in this city. You go get her right now, or I will personally make sure you lose your job. Donovan actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the cavernous lobby. He looked out the glass doors at the parking lot. A top-tier real estate broker. In a rented Kia. Sure you are, buddy. The door is right behind you. Walk through it yourself, or I will physically throw you through it. Two more security guards, both equally imposing, stepped out from the adjacent hallway. The message was abundantly clear. The bullying was over. Humiliated, powerless, and utterly defeated, Jamal and Brittany backed away from the desk. They turned and marched out the sliding glass doors, the heavy gaze of the security team burning into their backs. They practically ran back to the rented Kia. Jamal was shaking with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and pure rage. He kicked the front tire of the cheap sedan, screaming a string of profanities into the freezing wind. Brittany leaned against the passenger door, sobbing into her hands as the final desperate plan crumbled to dust. Jamal yanked his phone from his pocket with trembling fingers. He hit a speed dial contact and pressed the phone against his ear. The external security cameras mounted just above them on the facility wall tracked their every movement. High above the parking lot, sitting in a plush leather chair in a soundproof corner office, Cassidy watched the live security feed on her massive desktop monitor. She tapped a key on her keyboard, turning up the external audio feed. The high-definition microphones captured Jamal's voice perfectly. "Richard, your useless daughter refuses to even come to the lobby!" Jamal screamed into his phone, completely losing his mind. "You need to fix this right now. You need to drive down here and force her to empty her accounts. We cannot even get past the front desk." Through the phone's speaker, Cassidy could hear her father's frantic, trembling voice. "Jamal, forget about the warehouse. The bank just called me again. They are talking about a secondary lien on the house." "What secondary lien?" "We never authorized a home equity line of credit. The primary mortgage is in default, but they are saying there is a massive secondary loan." Jamal froze. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. Brittany stopped crying and stared at her husband, her eyes wide with sudden horrifying realization. "Richard, listen to me," Jamal stammered, pacing frantically around the tiny rental car. "I had to do it. The market was slow. I needed capital to float the business. I just used your name on the application to secure the loan. It was supposed to be temporary, but now that the primary mortgage is in foreclosure, the secondary lender is threatening to audit the signatures." "You forged my signature!" Richard's voice echoed through the speaker, trembling with absolute world-ending horror. "You committed federal fraud and attached it to my house. I was trying to provide for your daughter, Jamal yelled back, completely abandoning any shred of accountability or remorse. If the bank looks too closely at those documents, I am going to federal prison, Richard. You have to cover this. We need Cassidy's money right now to pay off the secondary lender before they report the forgery. In her corner office, Cassidy smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. She clicked her mouse, saving the high-definition audio and video recording to a secure encrypted cloud server. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely crushed them. Down in the bleak, wind-swept parking lot, the phone call between Jamal and Richard was rapidly devolving from a panicked confession into a full-blown screaming match. Richard stood frozen in his mahogany-paneled home office, miles away, the phone pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles turned stark white. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to stop his heart entirely. "You forged my signature on a federal bank document." Richard choked out, his voice dropping to a hoarse, terrified whisper. "You took out a second mortgage on my estate without my knowledge. Do you have any idea what you have done? The bank is going to audit the entire property. They are going to see the fraudulent paperwork, Jamal." "I was protecting the family image," Jamal bellowed back, pacing furiously around the rented Kia, while Brittany sobbed against the passenger door. "You think I wanted to do this? Your daughter demands a lifestyle. She demands the bags, the spa days, the vacations. I had to keep up appearances. If Cassidy had just stepped up and played her part, none of this would have been necessary. We were floating. We just needed a bridge loan." "A bridge loan is not stealing my identity," Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he finally found his rage. "You are going to prison, and you are dragging me down with you." The office door burst open. Patricia stood in the doorway, clutching her silk robe, having heard Richard's terrified screams echoing through the empty, repossessed mansion. She marched forward with the aggressive entitlement she applied to every situation and snatched the phone directly from her husband's trembling hand. "What is going on?" Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. "What is Jamal saying about the bank?" Richard collapsed into his heavy leather chair, burying his face in his hands. "He took out a secondary mortgage on the house, Patricia. He forged my signature. The primary lender is foreclosing and the secondary lender is going to discover the fraud. He ruined us. Jamal is a felon." Patricia stared at her husband as the horrific reality washed over her. The golden son-in-law, the man they had paraded around the country club, the man they had used to constantly belittle Cassidy, was nothing but a desperate, lying criminal. Any rational mother would have instantly demanded Jamal turn himself in to the authorities. Any rational human being would have recognized that Jamal and Brittany's unhinged greed had driven the final nail into their collective coffin. But Patricia's mind was a fortress of absolute delusion. Her brain simply could not process that her golden child and her perfect son-in-law were the villains of the story. If she accepted that, she would have to accept her own failure. Therefore, her warped psychology frantically searched for the only acceptable scapegoat she had ever known. "This is all Cassidy's fault," Patricia stated, her voice suddenly dropping into a chilling, venomous calm. Richard looked up through his fingers, entirely bewildered. "What, Patricia? Jamal forged my signature on a federal loan. He committed wire fraud. And why did he have to do that?" "Richard," Patricia snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the phone, "because your selfish, ungrateful daughter refused to help her own family. If Cassidy had just given us her retirement savings at Thanksgiving, like we asked, Jamal would not have been backed into a corner. She saw us struggling. She knew Brittany needed capital. She forced Jamal to take desperate measures to protect this family. She did this to us intentionally, out of pure jealousy." Through the speakerphone, Jamal eagerly latched onto this insane narrative. "Exactly. I was pushed into this, Patricia. I was trying to save all of us from Cassidy's financial selfishness. I was being a provider. Do not worry, Jamal." Patricia cooed into the phone, completely ignoring the fact that he had just committed identity theft against her own husband. "We are going to fix this. We are going to make her pay for what she has done to this family." Patricia slammed the phone down on the receiver, hanging up on Jamal. Her eyes were wide, burning with a frantic, unhinged energy. She grabbed her own smartphone from the pocket of her robe and furiously pulled up Cassidy's contact. She did not care that her calls had been blocked. She knew the carrier would still deliver voicemails, and she was determined to unleash the full force of her toxic wrath. In her corporate corner office, Cassidy watched the security feed as Jamal and Brittany finally climbed into their rented Kaya and sped out of the industrial park in utter defeat. A moment later, the red voicemail indicator flashed on her desk phone. She pressed the speaker button, leaning back in her leather chair to listen to her family's absolute descent into madness. "Cassidy, you listen to me very carefully," Patricia's voice hissed through the speaker, trembling with barely contained fury. "I know exactly what you are doing. You intentionally forced Jamal into a financial crisis out of pure malicious jealousy. Because you could not stand seeing your sister happily married and successful, you hoarded your money and drove him to take out that secondary loan. You are directly responsible for the legal trouble he is facing." Cassidy took a slow sip of her espresso, marveling at the sheer, terrifying scale of her mother's narcissism. The first voicemail ended. A second one immediately began playing. "You are going to fix this today," Patricia shrieked, all pretense of maternal affection completely eradicated. "You are going to march into your bank, empty every single account you have, and wire the funds to Jamal's lawyer. You owe us for raising you. You owe us for putting a roof over your head for 18 years. If you refuse to bail out your brother-in-law, I swear to God, I will drag you through the court system. I will sue you for elder abandonment. I will file a lawsuit claiming you financially abused your parents and intentionally caused us to lose our home. I will make sure everyone in your miserable little life knows you let your family face federal charges out of pure spite." A third voicemail dropped into the queue, heavy with desperate malice. "You have 24 hours, Cassidy." Patricia's voice echoed now, dropping into a low, threatening growl. "You either pay off that secondary loan or you are dead to us. We will destroy whatever pathetic life you have built. Call me back immediately." Cassidy deleted the voicemails with a steady clinical press of her finger. Dead to them. That was the most beautiful promise they could have ever made. They were spiraling, desperately grasping at straws, entirely unaware that the net was about to close completely. The eviction notices were finalizing, the repo agencies were closing their files, and now Cassidy had undeniable recorded proof of their federal crimes and their extortion attempts. It was time to pull the final string. She picked up her phone and dialed David, her wealth management attorney, ready to initiate the final summons that would drag them all into the blinding light of their own destruction. "David, it is time," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level as I stared out over the bustling warehouse floor through my soundproof office glass. "Send the final settlement summons to all of them. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal. Require their mandatory attendance at the downtown executive boardroom tomorrow morning. Inform them that the principal director of the fund managing their debt is willing to meet for one final negotiation before the evictions and criminal fraud reports are made permanent." "Understood, Cassidy," David replied smoothly. "They will receive the couriered summons by this afternoon. Shall I prepare the final asset forfeiture documents for the meeting? Have them printed and bound." I instructed, a cold smile forming on my lips. "I want them completely legally cornered." I hung up the phone and set it face down on my desk. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as I commanded. 20 miles away, the atmosphere inside the sprawling suburban estate was suffocating. The reality of their impending eviction had finally pierced through their collective delusion. It was Thursday afternoon, and the sheriff's deputies were scheduled to arrive on Friday at 5 o'clock to physically change the locks. The grand, echoing mansion had been transformed into a chaotic disaster zone of cardboard boxes and heavy-duty trash bags. The contrast was almost poetic. Patricia was furiously shoving imported Italian silk bed sheets into cheap orange garbage bags because she had refused to spend her last few dollars on proper moving supplies. Richard was tearing through his home office, frantically shredding documents and throwing his collection of crystal Scotch decanters into empty liquor boxes. In the grand foyer, Jamal and Brittany were engaged in a bitter, hushed argument over what items they could pawn. Brittany was clutching a stack of designer shoes, weeping hysterically, as Jamal informed her that they would barely get 20% of their retail value at a consignment shop. The tension in the house was volatile, ready to ignite at the slightest provocation. They were four deeply arrogant people suddenly forced to reckon with the horrifying prospect of sharing a cramped, low-income apartment. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the chaotic foyer. All four of them froze. Their eyes darted toward the heavy mahogany doors. Panic seized them instantly. They assumed it was the police arriving early to execute the eviction, or perhaps federal agents coming to arrest Jamal for the forged secondary mortgage. No one wanted to answer it. Richard finally stepped forward, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He smoothed down his wrinkled dress shirt, trying to summon whatever shreds of dignity he had left, and pulled the heavy door open. It was not the police. It was not a repo agent. Standing on the porch was a highly polished corporate courier wearing a sharp charcoal suit and white gloves. He held a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. The insignia pressed into the wax bore the crest of Vanguard Financial Holdings. Richard the courier asked, his voice strictly professional. "Yes, that is me," Richard stammered, eyeing the envelope with deep suspicion. The courier handed it over without another word, turned on his heel, and walked back to a waiting black town car. Richard closed the door and stared at the heavy envelope. Patricia, Brittany, and Jamal immediately swarmed around him like desperate vultures. "What is it?" Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Is it from the bank? Are they locking us out today?" Richard cracked the wax seal with his thumb and pulled out a single sheet of heavy embossed cardstock. He read the perfectly typed text in silence. As his eyes scanned the page, the color slowly returned to his face. His posture shifted. The terrified, broken man from 30 seconds ago suddenly vanished, replaced by the arrogant, entitled patriarch he had always been. "It is a summons," Richard announced, his voice vibrating with a sudden foolish surge of hope. "It is from the principal director of the management fund, the anonymous CEO who controls our debt." Jamal stepped forward, snatching the paper from Richard's hands. He read the words aloud for the rest of the room. "The principal director of Vanguard Financial Holdings requests the mandatory presence of all named debt holders for a final settlement negotiation. The meeting will take place tomorrow at 9 in the morning at the downtown executive boardroom. This meeting will determine the final execution or reversal of all pending asset forfeitures and foreclosure proceedings." The room fell dead silent. Then a collective, delusional wave of relief washed over them. They did not read the summons as a threat. They did not recognize it as a legal trap. Their narcissistic minds instantly interpreted the word negotiation as a sign of weakness. They genuinely believed the faceless CEO was blinking. "They want to negotiate," Richard said, a smug, greedy smile spreading across his face. "I knew it. These massive financial firms do not want the terrible publicity of throwing a prominent family out on the street. They want a deal. They want to structure a bridge loan to keep the assets performing." "Exactly," Jamal agreed, his chest puffing out as he completely forgot that he was facing federal wire fraud charges. "This is how high-level commercial real estate works." The CEO probably saw my portfolio and realized, I am an asset. If I can just get into a room with this guy, I can pitch him my market projections. I can charm him into a 90-day extension. I just need to speak his language. Patricia clapped her hands together, a manic, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "We are saved. I knew this family was too important to fall. We just need to play this perfectly. We need to remind this director exactly who he is dealing with. We are not some desperate charity case. We are the elite." Brittany wiped her tear-streaked face, her influencer persona snapping right back into place. "We need to look the part," Brittany declared, dropping her stack of designer shoes onto the floor. "If we walk into that boardroom looking like we are packing up our house, they will eat us alive. We need to project absolute, untouchable wealth. We need to look like we do not even need their money." The sheer level of their self-deception was staggering. They were facing total financial annihilation, yet they immediately began plotting how to manipulate the situation. They threw away their cardboard moving boxes and rushed to their closets. Patricia pulled out her finest pearl necklace and her most expensive tailored dress, planning to play the role of the dignified, wronged matriarch. She rehearsed her tears in the mirror, practicing the exact look of sympathetic distress that would surely manipulate a wealthy male CEO into forgiving their massive debts. Richard laid out his custom-made navy blue power suit, polishing his luxury dress shoes. He planned to walk into that boardroom and speak to the director man to man, blaming the entire situation on market fluctuations and temporary liquidity issues. Jamal spent an hour ironing his velvet blazer, convinced his flashy, aggressive real estate persona would dominate the negotiation table. Brittany spent 3 hours doing her hair and makeup, determined to use her physical appearance to charm whoever was sitting at the head of the table. They spent the entire night hyping each other up, building an impenetrable fortress of arrogance. They convinced themselves they were about to outsmart a billionaire. They fully believed they were going to walk out of that skyscraper with their mansion secured, their cars returned, and their debts erased. They dressed in their finest remaining clothes to play the ultimate victims. They polished their lies and sharpened their manipulation tactics. They were entirely, utterly blind to the reality of their situation. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous CEO they were planning to charm was the very same daughter they had just spent the last week actively trying to destroy. They went to sleep that night dreaming of victory. They were happily preparing to walk straight into the slaughterhouse. The freezing wind whipped off Lake Michigan as the rented, dented Kia Optima pulled up to the curb of a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of the downtown Chicago financial district. Richard adamantly refused to let the building valet see him step out of such a pathetic vehicle. He ordered Jamal to park 3 blocks away in a dimly lit public garage. The 4 of them walked the remaining distance, pulling their designer coats tight against the biting cold, their chins held high as if they owned the entire street. They were determined to look like titans of industry, completely ignoring the fact that they were walking because their luxury cars had been hauled away on flatbed trucks just days prior. They stepped through the revolving doors into a vast minimalist lobby lined with imported Italian marble and brushed steel. The security desk alone looked like a military control center. Richard approached the towering guard with his usual pompous swagger, handing over the wax-sealed summons with a flick of his wrist. The guard checked their identifications silently, his face a mask of absolute indifference. He swiped a secure keycard and directed them toward a private express elevator, reserved strictly for top-tier executives. As the elevator shot up to the 60th floor, the tension inside the small steel box was palpable. Patricia smoothed the wrinkles from her tailored dress, practicing her aristocratic smile. Brittany checked her reflection in the mirrored doors, frantically adjusting her lip gloss and fluffing her hair. Jamal rolled his shoulders, practicing his aggressive power stance, trying to shake off the terror of his impending federal wire fraud charges. Richard stared straight ahead at the floor indicator, completely convinced that his silver tongue was about to save his sprawling estate. The elevator chimed and the doors parted, revealing an entirely empty, pristine reception area. There were no assistants to greet them. There was no welcome staff. There were just floor-to-ceiling glass walls offering a dizzying panoramic view of the sprawling Chicago skyline. A single set of massive oak double doors stood open at the far end of the corridor, leading directly into the executive boardroom. They walked in their leather shoes, clicking loudly against the polished hardwood. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. A custom-built oak table stretched 20 feet across the center of the room, surrounded by heavy, ergonomic leather chairs. Richard immediately marched to the head of the table and took the seat of power. He gestured for Patricia to sit to his right, while Jamal and Brittany took the seats on his left. They arranged themselves carefully, sitting like royalty, preparing to receive a loyal subject. 9 o'clock came and went. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 9:15. The absolute silence in the room began to gnaw at their fragile, inflated egos. Richard tapped his gold pen against the oak table, his initial confidence slowly morphing into arrogant irritation. "This is a deliberate power play," Richard grumbled, adjusting his silk tie for the 5th time. "Making us wait like we are some desperate tech startup begging for venture capital. It is incredibly disrespectful. When this chief executive finally decides to grace us with his presence, I am going to make it very clear that our family does not tolerate being treated like common debtors." Patricia crossed her arms, her pearl necklace clicking sharply against the polished wood. It is incredibly unprofessional. They did not even offer us coffee or sparkling water. This entire firm lacks basic etiquette. I should speak to their hospitality director about this dreadful service. They clearly do not realize who is sitting in their boardroom. Brittany pulled out her phone, checking her reflection in the dark screen since she had no cellular service. She leaned over to her husband. Jamal, remember the pitch. Do not let him interrupt you. You take control of the conversation immediately. Jamal nodded, wiping a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead. I know exactly what I am doing, Brittany. I am going to hit him with the macroeconomic data. I will explain that the real estate sector experienced an unforeseen, unprecedented market crash. A temporary liquidity freeze that affected top-tier brokers globally. I will tell him my commercial pipeline is packed with multi-million-dollar deals waiting to close. I just need a 90-day bridge extension to unlock the capital. It is a standard industry pivot. He will respect the hustle. Richard pointed his gold pen at Jamal. Exactly. We maintain absolute authority. We do not apologize. We do not beg. We frame the defaulted accounts as a strategic financial repositioning. We are victims of a shifting economy, not poor money management. If he pushes back on the repossession of the cars, you tell him it was a voluntary lease return to maximize your liquid assets. Patricia nodded eagerly. And if he mentions the secondary mortgage, we tell him it was a clerical error by a rogue accountant. We deny everything. We project nothing but wealth and stability. They sat there in this quiet boardroom, feeding each other lies, reinforcing their shared delusion. They had completely forgotten the reality of their situation. They were entirely broke. Their vehicles were gone. Their house was being seized in less than 8 hours, and Jamal was facing federal prison. Yet sitting in those expensive leather chairs surrounded by the trappings of corporate wealth, they felt untouchable again. They convinced themselves that they were simply playing a high-stakes game of chess, entirely unaware that the board had already been flipped over. The digital clock shifted to 9:30. The tension grew thicker, suffocating the room. Richard let out an angry huff and placed his hands flat on the table, preparing to stand up and demand answers from whoever was hiding in the offices beyond the glass walls. Before Richard could push his chair back, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The heavy oak double doors at the far end of the corridor clicked loudly. The sound echoed through the empty reception area and pierced the dead silence of the boardroom. The family instantly froze. Richard straightened his posture, plastering on his most arrogant, practiced smile. Patricia smoothed her skirt, sitting perfectly upright. Jamal cleared his throat, pulling his velvet blazer tight, while Brittany quickly tucked her phone away and arranged her face into an expression of polite, affluent interest. Sharp, rhythmic footsteps echoed against the polished hardwood floor outside. The sound was distinct, authoritative, and completely devoid of hesitation. Someone was approaching the boardroom with absolute terrifying purpose. The footsteps grew louder, closing the distance down the hallway. The family held their breath, their eyes locked eagerly on the open doorway, completely ready to deploy their lies and charm the billionaire who held their fate in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, closing the distance down the hallway. The family held their breath, their eyes locked eagerly on the open doorway, completely ready to deploy their lies and charm the billionaire who held their fate in his hands. The figure that stepped through the heavy oak doors brought the entire room to a sudden, violently jarring halt. It was Cassidy. She was not wearing the faded discount sweater or the worn-out jeans they had mocked at Thanksgiving. She was draped in a $3,000 razor-sharp tailored charcoal gray power suit. The cut of the fabric was immaculate, projecting an aura of ruthless, untouchable corporate authority. Her hair was styled with sleek, effortless precision. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin held high, and her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of an apex predator walking into a cage full of trapped prey. Flanking her on either side were two men who radiated an equally terrifying level of professional menace. On her right was David, her brilliant, cold-blooded wealth management attorney. On her left was a senior corporate litigator carrying a massive stack of thick leather-bound folders and heavily stapled legal documents. The family sat completely paralyzed. Their brains, utterly poisoned by decades of narcissistic delusion, simply could not process the visual information in front of them. They saw the expensive suit, the high-powered lawyers, and the top-floor executive boardroom, but their ingrained bias against Cassidy created a massive cognitive dissonance. They could not accept that the scapegoat had ascended. Therefore, their minds instantly formulated the only narrative that preserved their fragile egos. They assumed she was a low-level employee who had somehow stumbled into the wrong room. Richard was the first to break the stunned silence. The fake charming smile he had prepared for the anonymous CEO melted off his face, replaced instantly by an ugly, contorted mask of furious indignation. He slammed his hand down on the polished oak table, the loud smack echoing off the glass walls. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard exploded, his voice booming with absolute outrage. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He genuinely believed that his most pathetic daughter had just jeopardized his one chance at financial salvation. "Are you stalking us? Did you track us down to this building to beg for money?" Cassidy did not flinch. She did not stop walking. She simply continued her steady, measured pace toward the empty chair at the absolute head of the massive boardroom table. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of aristocratic horror. "This is a private corporate floor, Cassidy," Patricia hissed, looking frantically toward the empty hallway as if expecting security to rush in. "How did you even get past the lobby? Did you take a second job in this building? Are you working in the cafeteria? Get out of here right now before you humiliate us in front of the principal director." Brittany let out a shrill, mocking laugh, gripping her empty designer handbag. "I cannot believe you, Cassidy. You are so obsessed with my life that you actually followed us to a closed-door financial meeting. You are literally insane. Go back to your dusty warehouse and push your little boxes. We are dealing with multi-million-dollar real estate negotiations right now." Jamal leaned forward, pointing an aggressive finger at Cassidy. "You heard your father. Turn around and walk out those doors. If the executives walk in here and see you standing around in that fake rented suit, they will throw all of us out, bring us some coffee, and get out." They had dug their graves to the absolute bottom. They had piled the dirt high above their own heads. Cassidy reached the head of the table. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the cool, polished oak surface. She looked at the four of them. She looked at her father's bulging neck veins, her mother's sneering disgust, her sister's petty vanity, and her brother-in-law's desperate, misplaced arrogance. For 33 years, their words would have crushed her. Their insults would have sent her spiraling into a deep, familiar well of self-doubt and unworthiness. Today, their words were nothing but the meaningless buzzing of insects trapped in a jar. Cassidy did not yell. She did not raise her voice to match their hysterical volume. She did not defend her outfit or explain her presence. She simply turned her head slightly to the right and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to David. The wealth management attorney stepped forward. Without a word, he hoisted the massive stack of heavy leather-bound folders and lifted them high above the table. He let go. The documents slammed into the solid oak table with a deafening, thunderous thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The sheer volume of paperwork, the deeds, the loan origination forms the default notices, and the asset forfeiture declarations spilled across the polished wood, sliding directly toward Richard's hands. Cassidy leaned forward slightly, resting her weight on her hands. She locked eyes with her father, her gaze as cold and unforgiving as the freezing wind whipping against the skyscraper windows behind her. "I am not the secretary," Cassidy stated. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the room with the force of a high-speed collision. She slowly turned her head, making deliberate, unbroken eye contact with Patricia, then Brittany, and finally Jamal. She wanted to ensure that every single one of them felt the exact moment the blade pierced their reality. "I am the owner of the house you currently live in," Cassidy continued, her tone dropping into a chilling, absolute calm. "I am the sole owner of the limited liability company that has subsidized your entire fake existence for the past 4 years. And I am the principal director of the fund you just completely defaulted on." The silence that rushed into the boardroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that instantly drained the oxygen from their lungs. No one moved, no one blinked. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of her words hung in the air, wrapping around their throats like a wire snare. Richard looked down at the documents resting inches from his trembling fingers. The bold black ink on the top page displayed the name of the anonymous corporate trust. Right beneath it, printed in undeniable stark clarity, was the name of the managing executive. Cassidy's name. The game was over. The illusion was dead. The pathetic failure they had mocked, degraded, and dismissed had just locked the doors of their financial slaughterhouse. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, so profound it rang in their ears like a physical frequency. Brittany literally stopped breathing. Her chest froze, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests of her heavy leather chair as if she were plummeting from a great height. Her eyes darted wildly between Cassidy and the staggering stack of legal documents, her mind completely unable to bridge the gap between her curated reality and the nightmare unfolding in front of her. Richard stared at the bold black ink bearing his oldest daughter's name. The thick paper trembled slightly under his gaze. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had built his entire identity on belittling Cassidy, looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He looked at Patricia, desperately seeking a lifeline, but Patricia was equally paralyzed. The matriarch who had demanded Cassidy drain her retirement savings just days prior was now staring at her own child with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Jamal shrank back into his chair, pulling his velvet blazer tight around his chest as if trying to make himself invisible against the leather upholstery. The confident real estate mogul was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified man, realizing his executioner had been sitting quietly across from him at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Cassidy did not give them a moment to recover. She did not allow the shock to transition into bargaining or denial. She reached into the pocket of her tailored suit jacket, retrieved a sleek silver remote, and pointed it at the far wall of the boardroom. A massive high-definition screen silently lowered from the ceiling. Cassidy pressed a single button, and the room was instantly filled with the sunny, vibrant ambiance of Brittany's patio. The video Aunt Carol had accidentally forwarded began to play. The sound of clinking crystal flutes and forced aristocratic laughter echoed off the glass walls. The family was forced to watch themselves in excruciating high-resolution detail. They watched Jamal aggressively mock the rusted Toyota. They watched Brittany complain about the absolute humiliation of being associated with a warehouse worker. And then came the killing blow. Patricia's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. "She is a pathetic failure. I honestly do not know where she came from. She has absolutely zero ambition. We should honestly start charging her an admission fee just to sit at our table. Maybe $2,000 a month." Cassidy let the video play to its agonizing conclusion. The final chorus of their cruel, unified laughter faded out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. She clicked the screen to black. The sudden darkness reflected the absolute devastation written across their pale faces. "That admission fee is going to be rather difficult to collect now," Mother Cassidy stated, her voice as smooth and lethal as a drawn blade. Patricia flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck. "Cassidy, please," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking and devoid of its usual arrogant bite. "That was just a joke. We were drinking. You know how we exaggerate. We did not mean it." "You meant every single word," Cassidy replied, methodically stepping away from the head of the table and slowly pacing behind her seated lawyers. "And the beautiful irony is that while you were laughing at my clothes and my career, you were actively burning through my money. Let us look at the exact numbers, shall we?" David, perfectly synchronized with his client, opened the topmost folder on the oak table. "Your primary mortgage." Cassidy began ticking the items off on her fingers with clinical precision. $12,000 a month. Property taxes $40,000 a year. Jamal's Mercedes G-Wagon $1,800 a month. Brittany's AMG Coupe $1,500 a month. Over the past 4 years, I have poured nearly $800,000 of my own liquid capital into maintaining your illusion of superiority. Richard's hands shook against the table. "You let us believe it was a corporate trust. You deliberately manipulated us into this position. I saved you, Cassidy corrected sharply, her eyes flashing with dangerous intensity. 4 years ago, you were days away from total bankruptcy. I stepped in because I possessed a naive, foolish loyalty to people who never once showed me an ounce of respect. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire from the ground up, and instead of sharing that triumph with my family, I had to hide it. I knew that if you found out I was wealthy, you would not love me. You would simply use me. And that video proved me completely right. Cassidy stopped pacing and leaned over the table, bringing her face level with her father's terrified gaze. I funded your arrogance for 4 years. The gravy train is officially over. Brittany finally found her voice, though it came out as a pathetic, breathless squeak. Cassidy, you cannot do this. I will lose my brand. My sponsors will drop me if they find out I am broke. You have to turn the accounts back on, just for a few months until I secure my next deal. Please. Your brand is built on a foundation of lies, Brittany Cassidy said, dismissing her sister with a single cold glance, and those lies are no longer in my operating budget. The room fell into a desperate, panicked silence. Richard and Patricia looked at each other, the reality of their impending homelessness settling deep into their bones. They had walked into this skyscraper expecting to charm a billionaire and secure a bridge loan. Instead, they were watching their own daughter methodically burn their kingdom to ash. But Cassidy was not finished. The financial ruin of her parents and the social destruction of her sister were only the beginning. The most severe consequence was reserved for the man who had dared to commit a felony against her corporate assets. Cassidy turned her attention to Jamal. He was sweating profusely, a dark, damp stain spreading across the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He avoided her gaze entirely, staring fixedly at the polished wood grain of the table. She nodded to her secondary litigator. The lawyer reached into his thick leather briefcase and retrieved a single stark red folder. He placed his hand flat on the document and slid it firmly across the long table. The folder came to a smooth stop, precisely an inch from Jamal's trembling hands. Jamal stared at the bright red cardstock as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I canceled the automated payments, Cassidy said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. I allowed the luxury vehicles to be repossessed, and I authorized the foreclosure on the estate. That was simply the termination of a bad, toxic investment. But you, Jamal, took things a step further. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Cassidy, I was desperate. I was trying to protect the family image. I was going to pay it back. You forged my father's signature to secure a secondary home equity loan against a property that my corporation legally owns. Cassidy stated her words, striking him like physical blows. You committed federal wire fraud and tied it directly to my corporate portfolio. She tapped the top of the red folder. And Jamal. The FBI has already received the file regarding your forged signatures on the second mortgage. Jamal let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He pushed himself away from the heavy oak table, his chair screeching against the floor, and doubled over as if he had been physically gutted. The velvet blazer he was so proud of hung off his trembling frame. The reality of federal prison, not just a financial penalty, but actual hard time behind bars, crashed over him. He opened his mouth to beg to plead for mercy, but the sheer terror locked the words in his throat. Richard finally snapped out of his paralysis. He slammed his hands onto the table, leaning forward with wild, desperate eyes. Cassidy, you cannot do this, Richard yelled, his voice cracking with panic. We are your family. You are going to send your brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. You are going to put your mother and me out on the street. You have made your point. You have the money. Just withdraw the foreclosure and call off the authorities. We will apologize. We will do whatever you want. I do not want your apologies, I said calmly, buttoning the center button of my tailored suit jacket. Your apologies are as worthless as the counterfeit luxury you built your lives on. And I cannot call off the FBI, Richard. Federal crimes belong to the federal government. You made your choices. Now you get to live the life you actually earned. Without another word, I turned on my heel. David and my secondary litigator gathered their briefcases and followed my lead. I walked out of the glass boardroom, the heavy oak double doors clicking firmly shut behind me, sealing my family inside the tomb of their own making. The execution of their brutal karma arrived with ruthless punctuality. Fast forward to Friday. At precisely 5 o'clock in the evening, the flashing blue and red lights of local sheriff cruisers illuminated the perfectly manicured driveway of the sprawling suburban estate. The legal grace periods were entirely exhausted. The eviction was absolute and unapologetic. Richard and Patricia were physically escorted out of the grand mahogany front doors by armed deputies. They stood on the cold concrete of the driveway, surrounded by cheap orange garbage bags, filled with whatever clothes and personal items they could hastily throw together before the deadline. The wealthy neighbors they had spent years trying to impress now stood boldly on their porches, holding glasses of expensive wine, watching the final, undeniable collapse of the neighborhood's most arrogant couple. The deputies placed heavy steel padlocks on the doors, legally barring them from the property forever, stripped of their bank accounts, their credit, and their dignity. Richard and Patricia were forced to move into a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment in an industrial neighborhood they previously would not even drive through. The peeling linoleum floors, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the persistent smell of stale cigarette smoke replaced their imported marble crystal chandeliers and fresh eucalyptus. There were no country club friends offering them a place to stay. They were entirely excommunicated from high society. Jamal's reckoning was even more severe. He did not even get the chance to unpack his few remaining belongings in that miserable apartment. Two unmarked black sedans pulled up to the curb just as he was carrying a garbage bag of shoes up the cracked concrete stairs. Federal agents wearing tactical vests stepped out of the vehicles. They did not care about his velvet blazer or his fake real estate mogul persona. They read him his Miranda rights right there on the sidewalk, slapped heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists, and shoved him into the back of a sedan. The forged signatures and the sheer magnitude of the wire fraud carried mandatory minimum sentencing. Jamal was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. The fallout for Brittany was swift and completely destructive. The socialite grapevine moved faster than the legal system. Someone from the country club leaked the foreclosure notices, the repossession photos of the matching Mercedes SUVs, and the public arrest records of her husband directly to a prominent local gossip blog. The digital exposure was catastrophic. Brittany's phone blew up not with lucrative brand deals, but with immediate termination emails. Her sponsors dropped her overnight, horrified to be associated with a family embroiled in federal fraud and a highly publicized eviction. Her comment section was flooded with laughing emojis and screenshots of her repossessed cars. Every single post she had ever made bragging about her fake luxury was mercilessly mocked by thousands of strangers. Her carefully curated influencer empire burned to the ground in a matter of hours. Stripped of her fake wealth, her luxury lifestyle, and her fraudulent husband Brittany filed for divorce in absolute disgrace. However, the divorce did not grant her an escape. It simply trapped her in that tiny, depressing apartment with her miserable, ruined parents. The golden child was finally forced to live the exact pathetic failure of a life she had spent years projecting onto me, completely stripped of the unearned privilege that had defined her entire existence. Over the next 6 months, the silence of my new life was occasionally interrupted by the desperate echoes of their ruin. My corporate legal team began receiving mail. Not just 1 or 2 envelopes, but hundreds of them. They were handwritten, tear-stained pleas mailed directly to the headquarters of my logistics firm. My mother wrote frantic, sprawling letters begging for forgiveness, claiming that she was blinded by stress and that a mother and daughter should never be estranged. Richard wrote long, rambling apologies, demanding family loyalty, and asking for just one more financial favor, just a small bridge loan to get them out of the terrible apartment. Brittany sent cards pleading for a job at my warehouse, promising she would start at the bottom if I just gave her a chance to rebuild her life. They invoked blood. They invoked God. They invoked every single manipulative tactic they had honed over 3 decades of psychological abuse. They pleaded for a second chance, swearing they had changed, swearing they finally recognized my true worth. I never read a single one of those letters. I sat in my corner office, watching the relentless, beautiful machinery of my business thriving below me. I instructed David and the legal team on exactly how to handle the influx of mail. I did not want them shredded. I did not want them thrown away. I wanted a much clearer message sent back to the cramped apartment where my abusers now lived. David, following my strict instructions, gathered every single envelope. He did not open them. He stamped the front of every desperate plea with a bold, red, undeniable mark. Return to sender. The heavy stacks of rejected letters sitting on David's desk were no longer my concern. I left the executive suites behind and walked out onto the suspended steel catwalk that stretched high above the warehouse floor. The ambient noise of the facility washed over me like a comforting mechanical symphony. 500,000 square feet of polished concrete vibrated with relentless productive energy. Automated conveyor systems hummed a steady rhythm as they routed thousands of packages through high-speed barcode scanners. Forklifts beeped in a synchronized dance across the vast loading bays, sliding heavy pallets of inventory into the waiting trailers of massive 18-wheelers. I gripped the cool metal railing and looked down at the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. Every single person working below me was earning a living, providing for their own families, and contributing to a massive functional ecosystem. There was no fake luxury here. There were no rented designer suits, no leased sports cars, and no forged signatures on secondary mortgages. This was raw, undeniable, tangible success. It was the exact opposite of the fragile house of cards my parents and my sister had spent their entire lives desperately trying to balance. They had built their entire identities on the perception of wealth. I had built mine on actual measurable value. As I watched a fleet of delivery trucks pull away from the loading docks and merge onto the outbound highway, I allowed myself a rare moment of deep, uninterrupted reflection. Society constantly demands that women, especially successful women, play the role of the perpetual peacemaker. We are conditioned from birth to be the emotional shock absorbers for our toxic relatives. The world expects daughters to absorb the poison of narcissistic parents and label it as familial loyalty. People will look you straight in the eye and tell you to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm, all under the insidious guise of being the bigger person. Blood is thicker than water, they say, wielding the phrase like a weapon to enforce compliance and submission. I rejected that narrative completely. I refused to be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of my parents' inflated egos. For over 3 decades, I was told that family was an unbreakable bond, a mandatory life sentence of shared genetics that required infinite forgiveness. But forgiveness without accountability is just self-destruction. My family did not want forgiveness. They wanted a return to the comfortable status quo. They wanted their anonymous corporate ATM to turn back on so they could go back to mocking my clothes and my career over crystal flutes of expensive champagne. They wanted the benefits of my labor without ever having to respect the woman performing it. Those hundreds of returned letters were not evidence of my cruelty. They were the ultimate proof of my self-respect. If I had opened even one of those envelopes, I would have validated their delusion that they still held some form of emotional leverage over me. By sending them back unread and unopened, I reclaimed the ultimate power. I denied them an audience. I starved their narcissism of the one thing it craved more than money, which was my attention. The absolute deafening silence I gave them was a far more devastating punishment than any angry confrontation or screaming match could ever be. Standing on that catwalk, feeling the vibration of the heavy industrial machinery beneath my feet, I finally understood what family actually meant. Family is not the blood that drains you. Family is not a group of people who belittle your existence, hide your accomplishments from their friends, and demand you finance their delusions of grandeur. Family is the people who respect you. Family is the people who uplift you and who never require you to buy your seat at their dinner table. My family was the team I had assembled here. It was David who executed my legal strategies with flawless, cold-blooded precision. It was Donovan who guarded my doors and laughed in the faces of those who tried to intimidate me. It was the hundreds of dedicated employees who showed up every day and helped me scale this business into an unstoppable corporate force. I had built my own community, a powerful network founded on mutual respect, hard work, and genuine integrity. I did not need the approval of people who measured human worth by the brand name printed on a handbag. I reached into the pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was completely clear of notifications. There were no frantic text messages demanding cash for holiday catering. There were no unhinged voicemails threatening me with frivolous lawsuits for elder abandonment. There were no manufactured emergencies designed to guilt me into financial compliance. There was just absolute pristine peace. I looked back down at the loading bays. Another wave of massive delivery trucks roared to life, their heavy diesel engines rumbling as they rolled out to distribute my success across the country. I had survived the scapegoat dynamic. I had navigated the financial extortion. I had walked straight into the lion's den and methodically dismantled the predators who thought I was nothing but easy prey. I had reclaimed my life, my wealth, and my sanity from the people who tried to steal all three. I took a deep cleansing breath of the cool industrial air. A genuine, effortless smile spread across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. The best investment I ever made was cutting off their funding, I said quietly to the empty space around me. I pressed the power button on my phone, watching the screen fade into complete darkness. I turned my back on the past, smiled, and went back to work. Fade to black. One of the most profound lessons to take away from this story is that biological ties do not guarantee unconditional love or respect. When the people who are supposed to protect and uplift you instead choose to exploit and belittle you, the bravest choice you can make is to walk away. True security comes from building your own independence and refusing to tolerate someone else's toxic ego. You simply do not owe anyone a seat at your table if they constantly disrespect your worth. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic relative to protect your peace? Share your story and comment below.